Welcome, Wapham crew, guys, gals, ghouls, and otherworldly beings. Let's climb aboard the mothership, secure our tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the La Platas on a rocky mountain high, get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners, and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in colorful Colorado. I'm your ghostess, TessaTNT, broadcasting from the Mile High Clubhouse tonight. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, and welcome to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I'm so glad you could be here this evening. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to do this and to have you here hanging out with me on the airwaves tonight. If you want to listen in your free time, whether you're working it or working it out, feel free to look me up on Spreaker.com under We Are Paradox Media. You can also find me on YouTube, where you can listen and watch, and that's under We Are Paradox Media. And basically, you can find me anywhere you listen to, download or upload or whatnot, your broadcasts and podcasts, and you'll find me there. I hope you are having an amazing, relaxing Easter Sunday. Sorry I wasn't here yesterday. I started cooking at 6. That's after being in town all day shopping, and didn't go to bed until 6:30 in the morning. So from 6 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. And yeah, next time I'll remember to start my bread first and work on all the other stuff later, because most of that time was waiting for the bread to rise and then forming it into rolls, basically balls, and putting them row by row, 3 at a time. And yeah, you have to let them rise again, which should have only took 25 minutes. But another thing I learned while cooking, I don't know if I've done this before, but unfortunately I added the scalded milk as well as the water and the sugar to the yeast instead of adding the yeast to that mix. So I don't know, it was a little more dense than I would have liked, and I'm hoping if I do it the other way next time, it'll probably be this next week or something, then, yeah, I'll try it putting the yeast into the scalded milk and water and salt and sugar, and we'll go from there. But yeah, it was all really good. I made some pico de gallo. I made some ham, which I cut off the bone and did in a slow cooker with, it was brown sugar maple syrup. So I took dark brown sugar and maple syrup and pineapple juice and some butter to make it stick, and cooked it like that, and it was very good. Very, very good. I also made a fruit salad with strawberries and kiwis and grapes and pineapple in it. I really think that it could have used like some nuts on the side or something to sprinkle on top, as well as some toasted coconut, and that would have taken it off the charts. But it was really, really good. And what is the other thing I made? It was a very nice salad. It was a strawberry spinach salad with homemade poppy seed dressing and feta cheese, and that dish was really good too. I'm thinking I made something else. Oh yeah, pico de gallo. Did I say that already? I think I did. Yeah, but it was really good, as I said. So, and everybody got along, no fighting or bickering or anything, with the family. And instead of having what everybody expected to be maybe just enough for everybody, we had people show up with all kinds of food. So everybody was free to eat whatever the heck they wanted, whether it be a cheeseburger, chicken breast, or whatnot. I think chicken would actually be good in this strawberry spinach salad. Yeah, I don't know. If you want the recipe, I can send it to you by mail, email, or text. You can send your requests or a letter, your ghost stories, anything you'd like through the mail at P.O. Box 663, Bayfield, Colorado 81122. And you can also, I was going to say text me, but I don't have my Skype number anymore. I don't want to give out my regular number, although it is my Four Corners Paranormal Investigations number, so it might not be too bad, but let's skip that one and go to email. We are paradoxmedia@gmail.com. And my name is Tess. Feel free to find me there. All right, so we had stopped reading the book we were previously reading, which was the 25, basically classics, the Horror Mega Pack 25 classic and modern horror stories. But I was able to check that out this evening and it's working. Luckily, my bookmark is where I had left it, but I think I'm going to go back a little bit so that way we can kind of familiarize ourselves with what's going on in this chapter. I believe it is The Walking Dead by E. Hoffman Price. But before we go there, I think it best, since we are toward the very end of this other book, would be to read that first and then to go back and read this book. So the book we're almost done with is Scary Stories for Sleepovers. That's sleep-overs. Number 1. And it's by R.C. Welch, illustrated by Ricardo Delgado. And it's not just R.C. Welch that's written in here. There's different authors that he has put in here for these sleepover stories. Finding our page. Right, so I did mark the spot where we left off, but I think since it was only 2 pages since the beginning of the story, I just start all over again, because that way, in case you weren't here last time, you'll be able to catch up on this story. The Dollhouse. Nobody really liked Ginny very much. On the other hand, that was probably because nobody knew anything about her, Karen thought as they walked to Ginny's house. Karen still remembered when Ginny walked into the classroom on the first day of school. She seemed to creep in as if she were afraid somebody would notice her. She came in and sat in the back of the room and didn't talk to anyone the whole day. In fact, if Miss Henry, the teacher, hadn't made the whole class sit in alphabetical order, Karen probably never would have actually talked to her, but because Jenny's last name was Victor and Karen's was Wells, they sat next to each other in the rear of the room. The first time Karen had tried to talk to her neighbor, she had little success. "Hi," she had introduced herself that first day. "I'm Karen." Jenny just nodded. "Hello," she said quietly. That was all she said. Looking back on that as they walked to Ginny's, Karen smiled. That was probably as far as things would have gone if it hadn't been for the elephant. Karen loved to collect miniatures. She was always getting her parents to buy her tiny tea sets and tiny chairs and things. One day she brought a little carved elephant to show Kelly, her best friend, at recess. It was made of wood and was perfectly detailed down to the 2 little nose holes at the end of the trunk. After recess, Karen put the little carving on her desk. It wasn't until halfway through class that she noticed that Ginny kept sneaking glances at the elephant. When the bell rang for lunch, Ginny turned toward her shyly. "May I see your elephant?" she asked quietly. Karen felt thrilled that Ginny was finally opening up. Sure, but be careful. I just got it, and my parents would kill me if something happened to it. Ginny held the delicate carving in the palm of her hand and stared at it. It's beautiful, she said. Do you like things like this? Karen asked her. Ginny nodded, still staring at the tiny pachyderm. I've got a whole collection of stuff like this, Karen continued, and my stepdad gave me these really neat miniatures from Asia. Villages carved inside eggshells and things like that. If you want, you can come over and see them. Ginny slowly put the elephant back on Karen's desk. She seemed to be thinking about it. Then she looked at Karen and smiled. Thank you. I'd like that. Karen shrugged. Sure, no problem. How about tomorrow after school? Ginny smiled again as she got up. Okay, she said, and left the room. Karen carefully rewrapped the elephant in tissue paper and put it in a matchbox. Then she went to lunch also. Her friend Kelly was waiting for her, anxious to talk. Don't believe it, she said, nodding toward where Ginny sat alone. You actually got to talk to her. What did she say? She really liked my elephant, Karen answered, still somewhat surprised at Ginny's reaction. So I told her she could come over to my house tomorrow and see the rest of my collection. And is she? She said she'd like to. I guess she has to check with her parents, though. Kelly shook her head. Why do you try so hard to be everybody's friend? I think she's a nice person. She's just so shy that her own shadow scares her. The next day, Ginny went to Karen's house after school. Karen's parents weren't home, so the two little girls had a snack, and Karen showed Ginny her entire collection of miniatures, from elephants and other animals to tiny carriages drawn by prancing horses. The jewel of her collection was the egg. A hole had been cut out of the front of it, and a tiny delicate village carved out of ivory had been set inside. The inside of the shell had been painted to look like the village was in mountains, with a powder blue sky above. This is beautiful, Ginny breathed. She stood up and looked shyly at Karen. I collect miniatures too. Oh, really? Like what? I brought something with me, she paused. If you'd like to see it. Karen smiled. I'd love to. Ginny reached into her book bag and pulled out a small wooden box. She placed it on Karen's dresser, making it stand on it at the end. Open it, she told Karen. Karen leaned closer and saw that the box was carved to look like a tiny wardrobe. It stood on 4 little feet, each finely detailed, and it had a wee little knob on the front. Smiling, Karen pinched the doorknob between her thumb and forefinger and opened the closet door. Wow, she gasped. Inside was a whole collection of miniature clothing. There were pants and blouses, simple dresses, and elegant gowns. Each one was perfectly made, right down to buttons so small Karen could barely see them. At the bottom of the wardrobe were all different kinds of shoes. Again, each one was perfectly made, as if they were really meant to be worn. Karen looked at Ginny in amazement. This is great! Where'd you get this? Karen looked at Ginny in amazement. Ginny smiled. It's from my dollhouse. I thought you might like to see it. It's fantastic, said Karen, turning back to the clothing. Carefully, she plucked out a dress on its hanger and examined it. It was about as long as her finger and looked exactly like a dress of normal size, right down to the zipper up the back. She hung it back in the closet. How come you've never brought anything like this to school? You could probably make some friends. Jenny slowly put the closet away in her bag. My dolls are my friends, she said quietly. That's silly, Karen scoffed. I'd like to be your friend. Jenny looked up quickly, and a smile flashed across her face. Then she looked down at her feet again. I'd like that, she said. If you'd like, you can come see my dollhouse too. Karen didn't take long to decide. Her parents wouldn't be home for another couple hours. Is it anything like that closet? Jenny smiled. Oh, yes. It's the best dollhouse in the world. Karen laughed. Then I guess I'll have to. And maybe Karen thought as they walked to Jenny's house, this would help Jenny open up a little more. Jenny led her up the walk and unlocked the front door. As she pushed it open, a musty smell floated out. The inside of the house was filthy. The shades were open, letting the afternoon sun shine through the unwashed windows. There was a layer of dust over everything, and a stack of old TV dinner trays was piled on the coffee table in the front of the television. Toys littered the floor. Karen glanced into the kitchen to her right. It was even worse. Dirty glasses and silverware were everywhere. The wastebasket was crammed to overflowing, and Karen could smell the faint odor of decay. She wrinkled her nose in disgust. No wonder Jenny was so shy. Her parents must be pigs. She was probably afraid to invite anyone over to her house. She turned to Jenny. Are your mom and dad at work? Jenny shook her head. No, you'll meet them soon. She looked around the house as if noticing the mess for the first time. Karen could tell Jenny was embarrassed. Come on, she said quickly. The dollhouse is back here. She led Karen into the den. There in the middle of the room was the biggest dollhouse Karen had ever seen. It covered almost the entire floor and looked like a small mansion. Karen's mouth dropped open as she moved closer. A hedge of trees surrounded the huge yard. There was a circular driveway, too. With the gate at either end, Karen knelt down to inspect the house more closely. She vaguely heard Jenny say she would be right back. Every detail was perfect. 3 little brick chimneys poked out of the roof, and someone had even thought to put rain gutters on the roof, with tiny little leaves in them. Karen moved in even closer. The impressive front door had an intricate design of stained glass, with a brass knocker in the middle. Each miniature window had a sill and shutters. The paint was gleaming white with blue trim. Karen peered in one of the windows. It was a dining room. She gasped in wonder. The room was filled with furniture, like the wardrobe Jenny had brought to school. There was a dining table with little plates and napkins set for dinner. A display case like her stepdad's stood to one side, with objects in it that were so small she couldn't even make them out. She moved on to the next room. It was the living room, that was also furnished in exquisite detail. And so were the rest of the rooms on the first floor. There were even tiny little mirrors in the bathrooms. Karen stood back in amazement. There wasn't a single girl at school who wouldn't die to own this. And here was Jenny, who never even mentioned it. She leaned forward again and looked into one of the rooms on the second floor. She thought that nothing about this house could further surprise her. But then she saw the people, seated in an upstairs den, were a perfectly carved man and woman. The man was reading a tiny newspaper. and the woman seemed to be knitting, but there was something strange about the woman. Karen leaned closer. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what was so strange. The woman's knitting needles were actually moving. She pressed her face against the window, not believing her own eyes, when the woman turned to look at her. The woman dropped her knitting and stood up. Then the man dropped his paper and ran to the window. Karen threw herself backward. Her head was spinning in confusion, and she seemed to hear a faint, high-pitched whine. This couldn't be real. "What's the matter?" asked Ginny from behind her. Karen rolled around to see Ginny standing there with a strange look on her face. "Those people, they moved." Ginny cocked her head to one side. "People?" she asked. Then she smiled. "Oh, you must mean my parents. So?" Karen blinked. She must have heard her incorrectly, but some animal instinct forced her to back slowly away from Ginny. "Well, what do you mean?" she asked in a hoarse voice. Ginny's smile disappeared. "They wanted to send me away, so I shrank them. They're the best part of my collection." Karen gulped, her stomach down. The faint whine seemed to be getting louder. "You're crazy," she whispered loudly. She felt like she was going to faint. "I'm going home." Ginny's eyes narrowed. "I thought you'd like my miniatures," she said accusingly. She took a step forward. "I thought you wanted to be my friend." Karen stumbled against the house, caught herself from falling, and backed around it. "Get away from me," she yelled. She suddenly realized that the noise that had been bothering her was coming from the rear of the dollhouse. Her heart pounding, she glanced down at the backyard of the house. The little yard was filled with children. They were all looking up at her and screaming in their tiny voices. Her stomach rolled over and her head pounded dully. As her vision turned black, she heard Ginny say, "You are just like all the others. They said they were my friends, too." Frankenkid. One night, Jeffrey was watching an old science fiction movie on television. It was about a man who built a robot to conquer the world. Then, when he died, the robot went crazy and started killing everyone. It was finally turned off by two scientists who found the inventor's notes and deciphered the secret code. As the movie ended, Jeffrey had an idea. He would build a robot. Not to kill people, of course, but to run errands for him and to show off to his friends. The next morning, he began. At first, he considered using some plastic blocks he had, but that wouldn't make a strong enough robot. So he pulled his erector set out and began assembling the legs. Just then, Curtis pushed open the door to Jeffrey's room. "What are you making?" he asked his older brother. "It's a secret project. I'm not supposed to tell you." Curtis came closer. "Come, what is it?" Jeffrey laid down the little wrench he was using. "Well, okay, but I'm not sure you're gonna like it." "What?" "Mom and Dad asked me to build another son to replace you." Curtis yelled, backing up. "You're lying." "I told you you wouldn't like it." Jeffrey picked up the wrench and calmly went back to work on his robot's legs. Curtis ran out of the room. A few minutes later, their mother came in. "Jeffrey, why did you tell your brother we wanted to replace him?" "Oh, Mom, I was only joking. How would I know he'd believe a dumb story like that?" His mother leaned against the doorway, her arms folded. Then she gave him the look. After a moment, he gave in. Okay, I'm sorry. I won't tell him things like that anymore. Jeff, I don't know why you say such things in the first place. What are you making anyway? A robot. Really? Well, maybe Curtis could help you. Jeffrey gave his mother his own version of the look. All right, she said, her hand up. Just stop teasing him all the time. Okay, Mom. Jeffrey closed the door behind her and got back to work. After he finished the 2 legs, he realized there was a problem. The legs wouldn't bend. How would this robot be able to get around? Then he had an idea. He dove into his closet and pulled out a shoebox full of wheels from old toy cars. He selected 8 of them, 4 for each foot, and began attaching them to the legs. It took longer than he thought, but he finally had 2 legs mounted on a platform of tiny wheels. He rolled the legs back and forth on the wooden floor, pleased with the result, and set them aside. Before starting on the arms, he decided to take a break for some cookies. As he walked through the living room, Curtis came running in from the backyard. Mom said you're making a robot. Jeffrey rolled his eyes. Yeah, so? Can I help? No way. This isn't baby stuff, you know. Curtis glared at him. I'm not a baby. Then why did you go and tell Mom what I said? Curtis didn't answer, and Jeffrey continued triumphantly to the kitchen. After his snack, he went back to his room and began work on the arms. Suddenly, he realized that he would need a body to attach all of this to. He thought for a moment, then ran out to the garage. On a shelf in the corner was an old metal bread box. He got that down and was about to return to his room when he noticed an old electrical cord sticking out from underneath his father's workbench. A bold idea was beginning to form. He took the electrical cord and a spool of copper wire, grabbed a metal punch, and snuck back to his room. He stood the bread box on one end, with the door in the back. He then used the punch to put 2 holes in the bottom and ran the wire through. Then he fed the wire through the center of each leg and wound it around each foot. As he attached the legs to the box, he realized his metal creation would stand nearly 3 feet tall. Next, he drove a metal rod through the sides of the box near the top. On each end, he put a small wheel for the shoulders. Then he attached 2 short metal rods to each shoulder. And at the opposite end of the rods, he screwed on another wheel to act as the elbow. Jeffrey sat back and chewed on a fingernail while he studied the arms. What was he going to use for hands? Then, with a smile, he scrambled to his feet and shot out the garage. He dug through his father's toolbox and managed to come up with 2 pairs of pliers. He returned to his room and stripped the rubber off the plier handles. Then he attached a pair to each arm to act as the robot's hands. For the finishing touch, he went to the kitchen, got a coffee can from the cupboard, and emptied the coffee into a bowl. Then he took the can out to the garage and selected 2 red Christmas lights for eyes. He also grabbed a regular light bulb to attach to the top of the head. On his way back to his room, he saw Curtis playing. Hey, kid, he said, stopping. You really want to help me with my robot? Curtis stood up. Yeah, what do I have to do? It's easy. Just go to the field and see if you can catch a lizard. A lizard? He says with a suspicious look. Why? Jeffrey shook his head. Do you want to help or not? All right, but Mom won't let me go by myself. Jeffrey considered this. Yeah? Okay, well, let's both go. He went and dumped the coffee can and the lights in his bedroom. Then he and Curtis told their mother where they were going and left. The field, which was actually a huge, overgrown, vacant lot, was a couple of blocks away. All the kids in the neighborhood used it for bike trails, hide and seek, and any other game they could think of. When Jeffrey and his brother arrived, however, the field was empty. Okay, Jeffrey said. A really big lizard would be best, but I guess any size will work. What's it for? Asked Curtis. In a burst of goodwill, Jeffrey told him, I'm going to use the lizard to bring my robot to life. Curtis was amazed. How? The lizard will move the robot's arms and legs when it moves its own. Curtis's eyes lit up. Wow, do you really think it'll work? Sure, why not? Jeffrey pointed to the far end of the lot. You take that half, and I'll take this one, okay? Curtis nodded and took off. Jeffrey began scouting the weeds around him. After an hour or so, Jeffrey was ready to quit. He had scoured his half of the field, and the only lizard he had seen had managed to escape. He decided to go see how Curtis was doing. He found his brother crawling through the weeds near the middle of the field. Any luck? He asked. I saw a dead one, but no live ones. Jeffrey nodded and kicked at a pile of dirt. Then it hit him. A dead lizard? That would be even better. Where was the dead lizard? He demanded. Over there somewhere. Why? Remember that movie Frankenstein? Curtis nodded. That one had scared him so bad he hadn't slept all night. Jeffrey had talked to the babysitter and talked her into letting them watch it. Remember how Dr. Frankenstein brought the monster to life? Jeffrey continued. He put together the parts of dead people and then zapped them with lightning. Yeah, so? So I'll do the same thing with a lizard. What? Wait for lightning? No, said Jeffrey scornfully. I don't need that much electricity. I'll use a regular outlet. I don't know, said Curtis. Do you think that's a good idea? Don't be such a scaredy cat. Come on. Where's the lizard? Curtis led him to the body. It was about 6 inches long, head to toe, and slightly dried out from the sun. Jeffrey found an old milk carton and put his prize inside. As they got home, Jeffrey turned to his brother. Now listen. You'd better not tell Mom and Dad about this, or I'll have my robot eat you up. I won't say anything, Curtis muttered. Good, said Jeffrey, as he started up the front steps. He immediately went back to work on his robot. He grabbed the coffee can, stuck it on top of the bread box, and punched 2 holes in the front. He poked the light bulbs through the holes and twisted a loop of copper wire around each one. Then he brought the wire down through the head into the body and laid the loose end at the bottom of the bread box. Next, he wrapped another piece of wire around the metal rod on which the arms hung, and he let that piece of wire hang to the bottom also. He carefully rolled his creation out of the garage. Then it was back to his room to get the lizard, the old electrical cord, and some scissors. On his way back out, he collected his brother. Do you want to see this? Curtis didn't have to be asked twice and jumped up after his brother. Wow, he whispered when he saw the robot. He turned to Jeffrey. What are you going to do now? Jeffrey placed the lizard body into the bottom of the bread box. he connected both of the robot's leg wires to the lizard's hind legs. He took the wire that was looped around the arm rod and wrapped it under the legs on the lizard's upper body. The wire leading to the coffee can was wrapped around the lizard's head. Then Jeffrey took the scissors and cut off one end of the electrical cord. He split the two wires apart and cut the insulation from the tip of each end. Then he stuck the two bare wires into the lizard's body. He carefully closed the door of the box and uncoiled the electric cord. He stepped back and proudly surveyed his achievement. His robot was ready for life. Taking the plug of the electric cord to a wall socket, he looked over at his brother. "Ready?" he asked, smiling. Curtis was too frightened to speak. He just nodded. Jeffrey paused dramatically, then plugged the cord into the socket. There was a pop from inside the robot, and the eyes lit up. A glow shone from atop the creature's head. Curtis screamed and backed away. Then smoke began pouring out of the back, and a disgusting smell filled the room. Suddenly the light bulbs dimmed and went out. Jeffrey unplugged the cord. The smell was getting worse, and Jeffrey had to keep swallowing. Curtis was crying. Jeffrey went over to his robot and opened the door. A cloud of smoke rolled out, and he waved it away. Lying on the floor of the bread box was the burnt body of the lizard. Jeffrey whirled to face Curtis. "Will you stop crying?" he whispered angrily. Curtis gulped his way into silence. "Gosh," Jeffrey said, "what a baby." Then he stormed out of the garage, leaving his brother behind with the failed experiment. An hour or so later, Jeffrey figured he had better clean up his mess in the garage. His dad would be home soon, and he didn't want to get in trouble for leaving his stuff all over the place. But when he walked into the garage, the robot was gone. The electrical cord still snaked across the floor to where the robot had stood, but the robot itself was gone. Jeffrey panicked for a moment, then he rolled his eyes and shook his head. His brother had probably hidden it to get even with him. Jeffrey cleaned up what was left, and while he was doing that, some of his friends came by. They were going to the lot, and Jeffrey hopped on his bike and joined them. By that night, he had nearly forgotten about the robot, but after dinner, he followed his brother into his room. "What did you do with my robot?" he demanded. Curtis looked at him. "Nothing. Why?" "Come on, Spud. Where is it?" Curtis shook his head. "I don't know, honest." Jeffrey thought about beating it out of him, but decided that he'd just ignore him instead. Sooner or later, Curtis would confess. "All right," he said, leaving, "but I'd better not find out you're lying." And true to his plan, he ignored his brother for the rest of the evening. When his parents came to say goodnight, he didn't mention the robot. In the middle of the night, something woke him up. He lay there, staring into the darkness, straining his ears. He heard it again, a tiny squeaking sound. He rolled over on his back and pushed himself up. His breath came faster. There was somebody in the house. The squeaking came closer, and Jeffrey suddenly smiled in relief. He knew what that sound was. It was the sound of wheels rolling across the floor. That's what Curtis was up to. The squeaking seemed to be right outside his door. Suddenly it stopped. Jeffrey slid out of bed and crept over to the door. When his brother came in, he'd scare him to death. The door slowly swung open, and standing in the doorway was the robot. Jeffrey jumped in front of it and growled. The robot's eyes glowed faintly red, and the bulb on top of its head flickered weakly. It stood still with its arms extended. Curtis was nowhere in sight. "Curtis?" he whispered. Then the robot shot forward and drove its arms into his throat. Oh no. The girl of their dreams. Lisa stood at her bedroom window and watched the moving van pull away from the old Mueller place. The house stood in the middle of a huge piece of vacant land on the edge of town, and Lisa's house was on a street that ran along one side of the lot. Her bedroom window stared straight at the huge decaying mansion. It had been empty for as long as she could remember, but this evening, just before sunset, a van had pulled up in front of the house. Two men had unloaded a couple of large boxes from the back of the driven van and drove off. "Have you seen anybody yet?" asked Chris, her brother, from behind her. "No, just the two moving guys. I wonder who would buy such an ugly old place." Chris shrugged. "Ugly old people?" he suggested. Lisa snickered and followed him down to the dinner table. That night she dreamed that a beautiful princess had moved into the Mueller house, and she wanted Lisa to come and stay with her. So Lisa moved into the house, and there she found everything she had ever wanted, all waiting for her. Lisa woke up in the middle of the night feeling strange. She felt jumpy and cranky, like she was hungry. The dream was still clear in her mind, however, and she slipped out of bed and went to her window. The windows of the abandoned house were dark, but its ancient walls seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, as if they were magically clean and white again. She stared at it for a while, then shook her head and went back to bed. The next morning, Chris surprised her by asking if she wanted to come check out the new people at the Mueller house. Still thinking about her dream, Lisa agreed quickly. They got dressed, then picked their way across the field. As they got closer to the house, Lisa could see that the broken windows had been boarded up. The remaining ones had heavy blinds drawn in front of them. They came around to the front of the house, and Chris stepped onto the porch. "Wait, Chris," Lisa whispered loudly. "What if somebody's home?" "Well, why else are we here?" he snapped. "If you're too afraid, go home." She thought about it, but then she remembered her dream. There was no way she was going to miss out on this one. "Go ahead and knock," she said. Chris stepped forward and rapped on the heavy wooden door. After a moment, the front door creaked open, and a man stood there. He smiled when he saw Lisa and her brother. "Hello, can I help you?" Hi," Chris began. "Well, I'm Chris Kohler, and this is my sister Lisa. We live in the blue house across the field. I saw you move in yesterday and came over to meet you." The man nodded, still smiling. "My name is Benjamin. My daughter Bryn and I just bought this house." "You have a daughter?" Lisa asked abruptly. "Yes, but she hasn't arrived yet. Maybe you could come by this evening after dinner. I'm sure she'd like to meet you." "Sure," Lisa said. "Okay," agreed Chris. "See you later." As they walked back home, Chris asked Lisa, "Why were you so surprised he has a daughter?" I had a dream about the house." Chris spun around and stared at her. "What do you mean?" She stopped, surprised by his reaction. "I dreamed that a princess lived there and that she was very lonely and wanted me to come live with her, and she gave me diamonds and jewelry and all sorts of things." Chris stared at her. "Me too. I had a dream about the Mueller house too." Lisa's mouth dropped open. "Yeah? Was there a princess?" Chris shook his head. "No, I dreamed it was more like a museum with all sorts of old swords and armor and stuff." Lisa didn't know what to think. She and Chris had always been very close, but they had never shared the same dreams. "This is weird, Chris." He nodded in agreement, and they returned to their house. That night after dinner, they told their mother they were going to visit the new girl in the Muller house. Back across the field they went, this time under the pale glow of dusk. The door was opened as soon as they stepped onto the porch. A girl stood in the doorway, outlined by the wash of light from inside. She was very pretty, with long black hair and dark eyes. She smiled at them. "Hello, my name is Bryn." Lisa felt as if she had found an old friend. She shot a glance at her brother. He was staring at Bryn with his mouth slightly open like a dead fish. She poked him with her elbow as she stepped slightly forward. "I'm Lisa," she announced, "and this is my brother Chris. We live in the blue house across the field." Bryn nodded. "Come in." Stepped back to allow Lisa and her brother inside. The interior was lit by what seemed like hundreds of candles in gleaming brass candelabra. To one side of the living room was a polished wooden staircase rising up to a darkened second floor. "The electricity's not on yet," Bryn explained. "My father's gone into town to see if he can find an open hardware store." Bryn led them to a big, overstuffed sofa and motioned for them to have a seat. "I'm really glad you came over," said Bryn as they sat down. "I always like to meet new people. Is this a nice neighborhood?" "It's okay," answered Chris. He proceeded to tell Bryn about some of the other kids who lived nearby. "So," Lisa asked Bryn when he finished, "where do you and your dad come from?" "We move around a lot." Bryn shrugged and laughed. "I don't even remember where I was born anymore." "Have you ever been to another country?" asked Chris. "Oh, yes. We used to live in Europe." "Really?" asked Lisa, sitting forward. "Where?" Bryn began telling them of all the different places he could remember visiting while she lived in Europe. Chris and Lisa listened in fascination. Suddenly, Lisa looked at her watch. They had been sitting here for more than 2 hours. It was almost 9 o'clock. "Come on, Chris," she said, getting to her feet. "We have to get home." Bryn rose with them. "I'm glad we got to know each other. Thank you for coming over." Chris nodded. "Want to come over to our house tomorrow?" Bryn shook her head. "I can't. I was very sick for a while, and my father wants me to stay inside and get as much rest as possible." "Well, you're okay now, aren't you?" asked Lisa with concern. "Oh, yes. Not 100%, but better." She smiled shyly. "It really helps to have someone to talk to." "When can we come back? Can we come back here tomorrow?" Chris offered. Lisa nodded in agreement. "That would be great," Bryn said. "Why not come over tomorrow evening?" So the next night they returned to Bryn's house. Lisa didn't talk to Chris about it, but she could tell that he liked Bryn as much as she did. The girl was fairly quiet, but she always had some interesting story to tell. Soon it became a nightly ritual to go over to Bryn's house and sit in the living room talking. They barely saw Bryn's father, but he didn't seem to mind the constant company for his daughter. One night after Lisa and Chris had returned home and gone to bed, Lisa had a horrible dream. She dreamed that Bryn was dying, and she was the only person who could help her. For some reason, she was not able to. She watched helplessly as Bryn sat in the middle of her living room and slowly withered away. Lisa woke up sweating. Then, on a hunch, she snuck down the hall to her brother's room and opened the door. "Chris," she whispered, "it's me." "What?" "I just had a nightmare about Bryn." Chris looked at her strangely. "What was it about?" he asked. I dreamed that she was dying and I had the power to save her, but I couldn't get to her. Chris was silent for a long time. Then he said, I had a dream like that too. What do you think it means? Lisa thought for a moment. Maybe she's more sick than she told us, and we're both picking that up somehow. Could be. Let's ask her tomorrow, okay? Lisa agreed and went back to her room. The rest of the night she slept without dreaming. The next day, as soon as they were up, they got dressed and ran over to Bryn's house. They knocked and rang the bell, but nobody answered. Lisa tried to peer into the windows, but all the shades were pulled down. The rest of that day, one or the other of them made sure to keep an eye on the house, but they never saw Bryn or her father. That night after dinner, they tried again. This time, Bryn opened the front door. Lisa jumped slightly. Bryn, we didn't see you come home. Bryn smiled. I haven't gone anywhere. But we came by earlier, said Chris, and nobody answered. Bryn shrugged. I must have been sleeping. She opened the door wider. But come in. I finally managed to unpack everything, and I'd like to show you something. Bryn led them through the front door, where her father sat reading. He didn't look up as they walked by him and down a brightly painted hallway. I think you'll like this room, she said to Chris, opening a door. Chris looked inside and couldn't believe his eyes. The room was filled with swords and weapons of every style. Shields hung on the wall with faded banners. Suits of armor lined the sides of the room, like soldiers at attention. Wow! He practically yelled as he darted forward into the room. Lisa pressed forward to see, but Bryn stepped in front of her. What was he so excited about? She asked, puzzled. All she had seen was some rusty old plumbing sticking out of the wall. You know how boys are, Bryn answered, leading Lisa to another room. Before Lisa could ask her what she meant, Bryn had opened the door to the next room. Now it was Lisa's turn to gasp in wonder. The room was lined with display cases. Each one had piles of jewelry, and necklaces and rings and everything else Lisa could imagine. It was just like her dream. She stepped forward, hardly knowing where to start looking. I'll be right back, Bryn said. She closed the door behind her, leaving Lisa in the room alone. Lisa lost herself in examining the wealth around her. She moved slowly from case to case, mesmerized by the treasures displayed. After a while, she thought of Chris. She straightened and looked around the room in confusion. She had a strong feeling that something was wrong. Chris? She asked in a soft voice. Then she ran to the door. Chris! She flung the door open and froze. The hallway was dark and smelled of damp plaster. The shining candelabra were gone, and in their place were single candles set on the floor. Painted walls were actually covered with peeling wallpaper faded with age. Lisa took a deep breath and plunged down the hallway to the room where she had left her brother. The door was hanging on one hinge, and when she pushed it open, it tore itself out of the frame with a screech and crashed to the floor. Lisa jumped back in fear, too startled to speak. The room was empty. The walls in here had nearly collapsed. The bits of plumbing were revealed like the bones of a corpse. For some reason, there were pie tins nailed to the walls, with old pieces of rags hanging next to them. Chris! Lisa yelled. Chris, where are you? Then her mouth snapped shut as she heard a loud crash upstairs. Lisa! Her brother screamed from somewhere above her. Get out! Heart pounding, breath coming in short gasps, Lisa ran from the room. She turned down the hallway toward the living room. The scenery had changed here as well. The fine, rich furniture was just old boxes of trash. She wanted her brother. What was happening to him? "Chris!" she screamed as her eyes darted around the room. Then she saw it. The true form of the sofa. It was a coffin, set in the middle of the room like a prized possession. Curled up on one end of it was a withered skeleton wearing the clothes that Bryn's father had been wearing. Lisa stared at the clothes, trying to accept what her mind was telling her. To her horror, the coffin lid began to rise. As she edged toward the door, a whiskered snout pushed its way out from under the lid. This was followed by the biggest rat she'd ever imagined. It perched on the edge of the coffin and stared at her. She saw movement out of the corner of her eye and whipped her head around to look at the staircase. Her brother staggered into view. "Chris!" she screamed. He turned toward her, and her heart seemed to stop. The left side of his shirt was covered with blood. It seemed to spray from a wound in his throat. He saw his sister and pointed to the door. "Run!" he said in a hoarse voice. Then Bryn pounced into the view. She was taller and older now, about the age of their mother. Her mouth was smeared with blood, and she advanced on Chris with hunger in her eyes. Lisa's legs buckled and her vision swam in and out of focus. Another scream from her brother jerked her head up. Bryn was standing over him, mouth fastened on his neck. "No," Lisa whispered, then louder, "No!" She scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door. She wrenched it open and practically flew off the porch into the field. Sobbing and choking, she somehow made it across the field to her house. She fumbled at the doorknob, then thrust herself inside. She stopped in complete confusion. She was back inside the Muller house. The door creaked shut behind her, and she slowly turned to look. Bryn stood there, smiling with red teeth. Her fangs gleamed in the light of the candles as she bent forward and clutched Lisa to her. Wolf in sheep's clothing. "Did you hear about last night?" Jerry asked Craig as he rushed into class before the bell. Was there another one?" asked Craig. "Yeah," said Linda from the seat in front of them. "A delivery guy. They found him in an alley." "The whole alley?" added Robert with great emphasis. "What do you mean?" asked Craig as the bell rang and kids started scrambling for their seats. "Well," said Robert, "they found an arm at one end of the alley, and by the time they walked to the other end, they had managed to find most of the rest of his body." "Robert?" The voice of Mr. Pender, the teacher, cut through the class. Robert swung guiltily around in his chair. "Sorry," he said. Mr. Pender slowly looked around the class. "All right," he said. "I suppose most of you have heard that there's been another killing." An excited buzz filled the classroom. Throughout the fall, the police have been finding the bodies of people brutally murdered. So far, 8 victims have been found. Most of the time, their bodies were slashed up so badly that they were in pieces. The story was on the news almost every night as the police tried to find out who the Schmuller was. "That's what I thought," continued Mr. Pender. "Well, it's because of these deaths that I've invited a special guest here today." For a brief moment, Craig had a vision of a wild-eyed killer springing into the room with a meat cleaver. Instead, the door was opened by a young policeman. I've asked Officer McCann here today to talk to all of you about safety, so please give him your attention. Mr. Pender turned to the policeman and gestured for him to start. Hi, class, said Officer McCann. Hi, they all yelled back. I'm going to talk to you all today about safety, began the policeman. Now, I know you've probably heard lectures from your parents already, but we at the police department want everybody to keep their eyes open and be just a little more careful than usual. Officer McCann, said Teresa in a loud voice, do you have any clues about the autumn slasher? Well, I'm sure you understand that I can't reveal any details about the investigation. I can tell you, though, that we do have some clues to go on, and we're doing our best to put them together and catch this criminal. He walked over and hitched one leg up on the corner of Mr. Pender's desk. But while the case is still open, it's very important for all of us to be as careful as we can. Now, many of you can tell me what you should do if you're approached by a stranger. Craig tuned out as the police lectured the class on safety. He knew all of that stuff. He had heard it from his father. He looked around at his classmates. Most of them were listening to the policeman. Some, like Jack, the new kid, seemed to be daydreaming. Jack was staring out the window, and Craig wondered what he was thinking about. Soon, Craig was lost in a daydream, too. At recess, the newest murder was the big topic of conversation. My dad says the police don't have any idea who's behind it, pronounced Bruce. But Officer McCann said that they had some clues, Teresa protested. I think it's some kind of monster, said Jack. I mean, who knows what kind of weird things live in the sewers and in abandoned houses? You really think so? Asked Gina with wide eyes. Why not? Said Jack, his voice dropping lower. Maybe at night, after we're all asleep, some hideous, flesh-eating creature climbs out of the drains and goes hunting for dinner. That's ridiculous, scoffed Craig. Oh, yeah? Asked Jack. Do you have a better idea? It's probably just some kind of psycho, answered Craig. I agree, said Teresa. My parents are always telling me to stay away from strangers. I've heard it at least once a day since the killing began. Yeah? Why invent some kind of stupid monster? Asked Brian. The best thing you can do is just stay away from strangers, like Teresa said. Most of the other kids nodded. And don't go out alone, Craig added. Well, my dad says that there are plenty of things that we don't know about, answered Jack angrily. That's right, said Anthony, jumping into conversation. What about all those scientific studies on ghosts and stuff like that? This prompted an all-out argument about monsters and ghosts and other weird things. By the time the bell interrupted their discussion, nothing was clear except that Craig and Jack each thought the other one was a jerk. The second half of the day passed by uneventfully. About halfway through class, Craig noticed Jack glaring at him, but he ignored him. He couldn't help it if Jack was mad at him. It was nothing personal. It was his fault for having such dumb ideas about monsters and stuff. When the final bell rang, the kids gathered up their books and poured out into the yard. Craig joined some of the other boys on the football field for the football game and forgot all about the psycho killers for a while. He didn't leave the school until late in the afternoon. Most of the kids had already been picked up by their parents. Some, like Anthony, were hanging around the front of the school waiting. As Craig walked out of the yard, Anthony called to him, "You'd better hope there's no such thing as monsters." Craig ignored him. He didn't care if Anthony wanted to believe those stupid stories about ghosts and monsters. He didn't know everything, but he knew there was no such thing as flesh-eating monsters that lived in the sewers. He jerked his book bag over one shoulder. Kids like Anthony were just jealous of him because his parents didn't treat him like a kid. He was allowed to walk home from school. He didn't have to wait for his parents to pick him up like the other kids. He sighed. He also had to admit to himself that there was really no reason for anybody to be jealous of him. The only reason his parents allowed him to walk home was because they were too busy to come pick him up after school. His dad was a lawyer and almost always had to stay late at the office. His mom ran a clothing store, and her favorite complaint was that something was always coming up at the last minute. So they told Craig that he had to act like an adult. That was his dad's favorite phrase. That's why he was positive there were no such things as monsters. Adults didn't believe in that kind of stuff. But sometimes acting like an adult is hard to do, especially when that meant walking home from school alone, when there was some maniac prowling around, waiting to stick a knife into the nearest person. At the thought, he snuck a quick glance over his left shoulder. The street was empty. He snorted and turned forward. He really had stayed at school longer than he should have. Now he was about halfway home, and nighttime was creeping in. The truth was, he had forgotten that it was getting dark a little bit earlier every day. One by one, the streetlights flickered and burned on. He was walking down a long street, lined by closed shops and black windows. He was trying not to think about the darkening sky when he heard something behind him. Trying not to look too scared, he casually glanced over his shoulder. His breath caught in his throat. What was that? He stopped and stared down the street behind him. Nothing moved. But hadn't he just seen a shadowy figure duck into the doorway of one of the shops? His heart kicked in high gear. He turned around and started walking faster. In the back of his mind, he thought that he still had to act casual. He had to act like nothing was wrong. That way, somehow, nothing would be wrong. Like his dad always said, act like a victim and you'll be a victim. He straightened his shoulders and held his head up. He darted another look behind him. He saw nothing, but he could feel someone watching him. He walked a little faster, his breath whistling in and out between his teeth. His eyes anxiously scanned both sides of the street. He searched up ahead of him for an open shop, a welcome glimmer of light that meant there was a phone inside to use, a place where he wouldn't have to act like an adult. Then he heard it, the soft scrape of the footstep behind him. He whirled around, but the street was still deserted. His heart began pounding painfully. He forgot about acting like a victim and broke into a run. His book bag thudded against his shoulder as he raced down the street. Why did everything in this stupid town close so early? There was not another person in sight. Now he was sure he could hear footsteps behind him. This time he was too afraid to look back. He tried to run faster. Suddenly, a side street appeared. Without thinking, he ducked around the corner and ran into someone. He screamed as he and the stranger both stumbled and fell. "Geez, what are you trying to do, kill me?" a familiar voice angrily shouted. Craig looked up in disbelief. Picking himself off the ground was Jack. "What's the matter with you?" Jack demanded. "I think he's after me." Craig gulped in the air. "Who?" "The killer. I think he's behind me." Jack looked around in fear. "Oh, man, are you sure?" Craig nodded. Okay, he muttered, looking left and right. "We'd better get out of here. Come on, let's go this way." Craig scrambled to his feet and ran after Jack. It was obvious that Jack knew the area because he led them down a couple side streets and then an alley without stopping to look. Craig kept looking behind him, but nobody appeared. Suddenly he realized that they were in a dead end. Jack was stopped. He looked like he was staring at the wall in front of him. Was he looking for some secret passageway? Was he going to climb it? "What are you doing?" Craig asked Jack from behind. "How will we get out of here?" Jack made a noise that sounded like a cross between laughing and coughing. "We won't," he answered. "What do you mean?" Jack turned around. Thick brown hair was sprouting from his face. His body seemed to bulge out in strange places under his clothes. He held up a hand with razor-sharp claws. "So," he rasped, "you still don't believe in monsters?" The Thrill Seekers Club. "All right," announced Peter. "I'll do it." He stared defiantly at the other boys in the street. More than anything, Peter wanted to be a part of the Thrill Seekers Club. Everybody did. It was the club to be in. All the other boys in the Thrill Seekers were older than Peter, but he was sure he could prove to them that he was brave enough to be in their club. "Okay," said Andy, who was 11 years old and the leader. "We'll meet back here tomorrow morning. If you have the flower pot from Old Man Stamper's grave, then you're in the club." The other boys nodded in agreement. "And if you're not here," added Matt, "then we'll know you were too afraid to do it." "Either that," said Andy, "or Old Man Stamper got you." The older boys laughed as they climbed one by one down the wooden ladder nailed against the tree that held the clubhouse. Peter waited a moment, then he climbed down too and trudged back to the street. He stopped in the field at the edge of the forest. From where he stood, he could see the late afternoon sun shining on the giant iron gate of the Final Haven Cemetery. It was the town's only graveyard, and it had been there forever. The town's first mayor was buried there, and he had died nearly 100 years ago. Mr. Finch, the cemetery gardener, seemed like he'd been around for the last 100 years, too. He was a strange man who lived in a small cottage near the very center of the cemetery. He almost never came outside the walls of the cemetery, except to close the gate every night. Peter had seen Mr. Finch only once. He was tall and thin, had completely white hair, and he hitched one leg up when he walked. The slightly hunched back made him look kind of spooky, and he always wore a black shirt and black pants. On cold days, he wore a heavy black overcoat. Peter was starting to have second thoughts. If Finch caught him, his dad was sure to find out, and he knew he'd be grounded for the rest of his life if that happened. He tried to convince himself that he wasn't scared as he passed the cemetery and headed home. When he got there, his best friend David was sitting on the front porch waiting for him. "Well?" asked David as Peter walked up. "What happened? Are they going to let you in?" Peter put his finger to his lips and crept around to the side of the house. David followed. "I think so," Peter answered. "But first, the guys want me to prove I'm not chicken." "Well, how are you going to do that?" "I have to go to the cemetery tonight and steal the flower pot from Old Man Stamper's grave." David's eyes grew wide. "Tonight? And it's pitch black? In the cemetery? What, are you crazy?" Peter hushed him angrily. This was not what he wanted to hear. "Big deal," he said. "It's just a dumb flower pot, and been through the cemetery before." "Yeah, but never at night," David replied. "And besides, how are you going to get out of the house without your parents knowing?" Well, I'm gonna wait until they go to sleep, then I'll sneak out the back door. David threw his hands into the air. Oh man, that means you won't get to the cemetery until like almost midnight. Peter didn't answer. David poked at a spider with his toe. After a long silence, he spoke. Well, said David, I can't understand why you want to get into that stupid club, but since you do, he took a deep breath. I'll go with you tonight if you want. Peter felt a wave of relief. Great! I'll come by tonight and knock on your window. Around 11? After dinner, Peter watched television with his dad for a while, then went to bed. He lay there in silent anticipation until he heard his parents go to bed. Then he quietly and carefully got dressed and crept to the back door. He opened it slowly and squeezed outside. It was a cool night, and he ran nearly all the way to David's house. When he got there, he rapped softly on his friend's bedroom window. Within seconds, David's face appeared. He gave Peter the thumbs-up sign and was outside a minute later. I can't believe we're doing this, David said as they made their way up the street, trying to stay in the shadows. By the time they reached the cemetery, clouds had begun to cover the moon. There was just enough light from the street lamps to see the gate, but Peter knew it would be dark inside. Why hadn't he remembered to bring a flashlight? How are we going to get in? David asked. Peter surveyed the huge gate. The bars were too close together to squeeze through. We'll have to climb over, he decided, and without waiting for David's answer, he climbed over the gate. David followed right behind him. Once on the other side, they paused to stare down the long central path of the cemetery. Twisted oaks clung to the edge of the path, forming a dark tunnel. More trees dotted the graveyard landscape, lurking in the black pools of their shadows. Peter thought he heard something moving in the branches, but he couldn't see any birds or breeze. The remaining space around them was filled with monuments of the dead. To either side of the dirt path, gravestones, statues, and crosses seemed to grow out of the ground. Whenever the moon would float from behind the clouds, the mix of the white stones and crazily angled shadows was almost too confusing to look at. I still think this is crazy, David whispered. Are you sure you want to do this? Let's forget about it. We can form our own club. Peter was really tempted to agree, but he took a deep breath and shook his head. He had come this far. He might as well go through with it. Come on, he said, moving cautiously forward. Andy told me that Stamper's grave is toward the back of the cemetery and the oldest part. Oh, great, David hissed, but he followed his friend. The farther they got from the gate, the darker their surroundings became. The oak trees seemed to strain toward them as they bravely made their way forward. The clouds had almost completely covered the moon by now, and, except for the sound of their own footsteps, the cemetery was eerily quiet. Even the birds had stopped moving. Finally, they reached the end of the path, where a small chapel hunched under the trees. Can we go back now? David asked. Peter stopped abruptly and swung to face his friend. Look, are you with me or not? He whispered loudly. All we have to do is get the flower pot and go. Okay, David replied. Let's get it over with. Peter nodded. Come on, it's not much farther. They quickly passed by the chapel and began picking their way through the tombstones. Once in a while, the moon would shine through a hole in the clouds, helping them to see. Here in the old part of the cemetery, the trees were very big. They seemed to be closer, too, as if wanting to grab the two boys. The grass was thick and uncut, and ivy covered many of the tombstones. Crooked stones and broken statues were everywhere. Suddenly, Peter looked up, and they were there. A huge tombstone stood before them, and at the top of the stone Peter read the name, Stamper. Off to one side was a small clay flower pot with some dried flowers in it. Peter lunged for the pot, but it was stuck in the ground and wouldn't pull free. No matter how hard he tried, he could not get it to move. In anger, he kicked at the pot, but missed and hit the tombstone instead. "You hurry!" hissed David as Peter hopped from foot to foot. "Stupid thing is stuck!" David came over, and the two boys tugged on the pot. Suddenly there was a crash as the thing shattered in their hands. They stared at the pot for a moment. Then there was a grunting sound from the trees to the right. The two boys looked at each other in terror. With a sob, David bolted for the front of the cemetery. "Wait!" Peter cried out, but his voice didn't seem to work. He grabbed a piece of the flower pot and took off through the tombstones after David, but as he heard the snapping of branches behind him, his legs seemed to stop working. He stumbled over something and tumbled headfirst to the ground. Panting in fear, he scrambled to get to his feet. Just then, a hand grabbed his shoulder. Peter spun around, his heart beating so fast it felt like it would explode. It was Mr. Finch. Peter couldn't see his face, but he was dressed in black as usual, except instead of his black overcoat, he was wearing something like a robe with a hood. Mr. Finch did not speak, but yanked Peter to his feet and began pulling him forward. Peter let himself be led. He knew he should be worried about what his parents would say when Mr. Finch told them he'd been caught sneaking around the cemetery at night, but he was still trying to recover his breath. And David, that chicken, he was going to get out of it. Peter sighed. At least he'd be able to prove to the Thrill Seekers Club that he had been here. The moon came out from behind the cloud, and in the pale light, Peter could see that they were walking deeper into the cemetery. Hey, Mr. Finch," he said. "This isn't the way to the front gate." They stopped. "No," came the answer as the figure turned toward him. Peter screamed in horror as he saw the rotting, skeletal face of the thing that held him. But as the creature pulled him closer, he realized that only the dead could hear him. Well, boys and girls, that is the end of that book. So now we're going to move on to our second book, which was actually our original book before this one and the one before that. All right. So this book, as I had mentioned before, is the Horror Megapack, 25 classic and modern horror stories. The story that we are on currently, see, I went forward, actually backward, because I thought we were on the Walking Dead story, but we are on the Lucifer story. Now, the theory of this strange sect is not without a certain distorted rationality. They argue that Lucifer's star of the morning was cast out of heaven after a great battle in which he was defected, to be sure, but not destroyed, nor even crippled. Today, after centuries of missionary zeal, Christianity has gathered only a type of the people into its fold. The great majority is, and always has been, outside. The wicked flourish, often the righteous stumble, and at the last great battle of Armageddon, the Luciferians believe that their champion will finally triumph. Meanwhile, and in almost impenetrable secrecy, they practice their infamous rites and serve the devil, foregathering preferably in some abandoned church, which has an altar, and above it a crucifix which they reverse. It is believed that they number hundreds of thousands and flourish in every quarter of the world, and it is presumed that they employ crypts and passwords. But amid so much that is conjecture, this fact stands clear. The cult of Lucifer does exist, and has from time immemorial. I never had the least idea who suggested them to Sir William. May have been some friend who was a secret devotee, and wished to make a proselyte. May have been an idle word overheard in a club or pennybus. The point is, he did hear, discovered that an occult power was claimed by their unholy priests, was ready to mortgage his estate or still sell his soul for this little chap, and somehow got in touch with them. The fact that he managed it, that he browbeat Watts Bedloe into permitting one of the fraternity to enter the hospital at all, is the best example I can give of his despairing persistence. At that, the physician agreed only upon certain seemingly prohibitive conditions. The fellow was not to touch the little patient, nor even to draw near his bed. He was not to speak to him or seek to hold his gaze. No phony hypnotism or anything like that. Watts Bedloe, I think, framed the conditions in the confident hope that they would end negotiations, and he was profoundly disgusted when he learned that the Luciferian, though apathetic, was not in the least deterred by the hardness of the terms. It appeared that he had not been at all willing to come under any circumstances, that he tried persistently to learn how Sir William had heard of him and his address, and that he had refused remuneration of any sort. Altogether a new breed of fakir, you see. There were 5 of us in the room at the time, appointed besides the little patient, who was sleeping peacefully. Fact is, Watts Bedloe had taken the precaution of administering a sleepy draught, in order that the quack might not in any possible way work upon his nervous system. Watts Bedloe was standing by the cot, his sandy hair rumpled, his stiff moustache bristling, for all the world like an Airedale terrier on guard. The father was there, of course, and the head nurse, and a powerful and taciturn orderly. You can see that there wasn't much chance of the devil man pulling off anything untoward. When precisely on the moment the door opened and he stood before us, I suffered as great a shock of surprise as ever in my life, and a rapid glance at my companions' faces showed me that their amazement equaled mine. I don't know just what type we had visualized, whether a white-bearded mystic clad in a long cloak with a peaked hat bearing Kabbalistic symbols, or a pale, sinister, and debonair man of the world, such as George Arliss has given us, or whatnot, but certainly not the utterly insignificant creature who bowed awkwardly and stood twirling a bowler hat in his hand as the door closed behind him. He was a little plump, bald man with middle age, looking for all the world like an unsuccessful greengrocer or a dealer in butter and cheese, in a small way, although the day was cool, with a damp yellow fog swirling over the city. He perspired freely and continually wiped his brow with a cheap bandana. He seemed at once ill at ease, yet perfectly confident, if you know what I mean. I realize that it sounds like silly rot, but that is the only way I can describe him, utterly certain that he could do for which he had come, but very much wishing that he were anywhere else. I heard Watts Bedloe mutter, "My word," and I believe he would have spat disgustedly, were such an act thinkable of a physician in a London hospital. The Luciferian priest turned to Sir William. When he spoke, it seemed entirely in keeping with his appearance that he should take liberties with his aspirates. "I'm me lord, and hat's your service." Watts Bedloe spoke sharply. "Look here, my man," he said. "Do you pretend to say that you can make this crippled child whole?" The strange man turned his moist, pasty face livid in the fog murk toward the specialist. That I serves can and will. I'm a middleman, in a manner of speaking, a transmitter. It's easy enough for him, but I don't advise it, and I warned you I'm not to be held responsible for how he does it. Watts Bedloe turned to Sir William. Let's have an into the sickness farce, he said curtly. I need fresh air. Sir William nodded to the little man, who mopped his brow with his bandana and pointed to the cot. Draw back the coverlet, he commanded. The nurse obeyed after questioning glance at Watts Bedloe. Take off his nightgown, continued the visitor. Watts Bedloe's lips parted in a snarl at this, but Sir William arrested him with a gesture, stepped to his son's side, and with infinite gentleness took off the tiny gown, leaving the sleeping child naked in his bed. Again, as always, I felt a surge of pity sweep through me. The mobile head, the pigeon breast, rising and falling softly now, the crooked spine, the little gnarled, twisted limbs, but my attention was quickly drawn back to the strange man. Barely glancing at the child, he fumbled at his greasy waistcoat, Watts Bedloe watching him meanwhile like a lynx, as he took out a crumb of chalk and, squatting down, drew a rude circle on the floor about him, a circle of possibly 4 feet in diameter. And within this circle he began laboriously to write certain works and figures. Hold on there, spoke Bliven. Certain words and figures. Just what symbols, please? There was a swastika emblem, Voice promptly replied, and others familiar to some of the older secret orders and sometimes found on Aztec ruins and Babylonian brick tablets, the open eye, for instance, and a rude fist with thumb extended. Also, he scrawled the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, the 8 omitted. You notice which he multiplied by 18 and again by 27 and by 36. You can amuse yourselves working it out. The result is curious. Lastly, he wrote the sentence sigma te sigma, temer me, tangus et angus. A palindrome, you'd observe. That is, it reads equally well or ill, backward or forward. Hocus pocus, old stuff, snorted Bliven. Royce gazed mildly at him. Old stuff, as you say, Professor. Older than recorded history, having done this, a matter of 5 minutes perhaps, with Watts Bedloe becoming more and more restless, and evidently holding myself in with difficulty. The fellow rose stiffly from his squatting position, carefully replaced the fragment of chalk in his pocket, mopped his brow for the 20th time, and gestured toward the cot with a moist palm. Now cover him up, he ordered. All hop, head and all. The nurse gently drew the sheet over the little form. We could see it rise and fall with a regular respiration of slumber. Suddenly, eyes wide open and staring at the floor, the fellow began to pray in Latin, and whatever his English, his Latin was beautiful to listen to, and virgin pure. It was too voluble for me to follow verbatim. I made as good a transcript as I could a bit later, and will be glad to show it to you. Livin', but anyhow, it was a prayer to Lucifer, at once an adoration and a petition that he would vouchsafe before his Christian unbelievers a proof of his dominion over fire, earth, air, and water. He ceased abruptly as he had begun and nodded toward the cot. Get this done, he sighed, and once again mopped his forehead. You infernal charlatan, snarled Watts Bedloe, unable longer to contain himself. You've got the effrontery to stand there and tell us anything has been wrought upon that child by your slobbering drivel. The man looked at him with lustreless eyes. Look for yourself, governor, he answered. It was Sir William who snatched back the sheet from his son. Until my dying day, I shall remember the unearthly beauty of what our astounded eyes beheld. Lying there, smile upon his lips, like a perfect form fresh from the hand of his creator, his little limbs straight and delicately rounded, a picture of almost awesome loveliness, lay the child we had but 5 minutes before seen as a wrecked and broken travesty of humanity. Again Blivin interrupted explosively. "Oh, I say now, Royce, I'll admit you tell a ripping story as such. You had even the hanging breathless on your climax, but this is too much. As man to man, you can't sit there and tell us this child was cured." "I didn't say that, for he was dead." Blivin was speechless for once, but Holmes spoke up in remonstrance. "It seems strange to me that such a queer story should not have been repeated and discussed." "It isn't strange if you happen to know anything about London hospitals," Royce explained patiently. "Who would repeat it? Would Watts Bedloe permit it to be known that by his permission some charlatan was admitted, and that during his devilish incantations his patient died? Would the stricken father mention the subject even to us, or the head nurse and orderly? Cogs in an inexorable machine. All this took place nearly 40 years ago, and it is the first time I have spoken of it. Watts Bedloe died years back, and Sir William's line is extinct. I can't verify a detail, but it all happened exactly as I have stated. As for the Luciferians, none of us, I think, saw him depart. He simply stole out in the slimy yellow fog, back to whatever primitive hell it was he came from, somewhere in London, the city nobody knows, and where anything may happen." Pennies from Hell by Darrell Schweitzer. I met Jim Bowen for the first time in over 10 years in a 50s revival bar in Philadelphia. It was the sort of place with posters of James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, and Elvis on the walls. The waiters in regulation duck's-ass hairdos, an interior decorating style which can only be described as art taco, and of course, inevitably a dance floor. A sign over the entrance said, "Bop till you drop." Wasn't Jimbo's style, but there he was. I called him over to my table. He looked up, didn't seem to recognize me at first, and then slid off his bar stool, glass in hand, not stumble down drunk, but walking carefully. That, too, wasn't his style. "You've changed," I said. "Well, I'm 43, Chucky boy. I can still call you that, I hope, for all your big-time novelists now. For me, the downhill slide into senility is already begun. Not much longer, and I'll be decrepit enough to get a job as an extra in the night of the return of the Revenge of the Living Dead Part 2. I could tell that he was, as we literary types phrase it, in his cups. "This isn't like you. At least it's a grown-up obsession," he nodded toward his glass. I glanced at the picture of Roy Rogers and Trigger on the wall behind him. "So, why are you worried about being grown up all of a sudden?" "You remember what I say, or what I used to say, Chucky boy. In American society, we remain adolescents until they issue us bifocals. Well, I wear contacts, but the time has come, as inevitably it must. I think that's why I come here." He lifted his glass and pointed one finger at Jimmy Dean, then at Elvis. "This place is a mausoleum of lost youth. It reminds us that time is passing." "Awfully morbid of you, Jimbo, old buddy." "Well, damn it, I have every right to be morbid. Sometimes I get to thinking about Joe Eisenberg, the cartoonist who died. Yeah, he was after your time. You'd gone off to commit literature by then." "I met him in your office once," I said. "Besides, after I stopped writing for underground comics, I still read them. At least the ones you published." "I love Eisenberg stuff, as far out as C.S. Clay Wilson." only he could draw. I particularly remember the upside-down face series. This guy with his nose pointing up and corks with little crucifixes stuck in his nostrils, and the caption, "Damned uncomfortable, but it sure keeps the snot vampires away." Great stuff. Elegant. Tasteful. But he never grew up, and it was a childish obsession that killed him. I never knew exactly how he died. Jim went back to the bar for another drink. I had a hunch I was going to need an excuse to linger for some time yet, so I called a waitress over and ordered a brown cow and a wing-a-dang burger. My friend came back, sat down again, and drank in silence for several minutes, then finally said, "I suppose I've set myself up for this. I might as well tell you the whole story. You don't have to believe a word of it, but you can listen. Maybe you can use some of it in a book." "Jimbo, I may have called you a lot of things, but never a liar. Just listen." "Okay," I said. "Well, the first thing you have to remember," Jim began, "is that Joe Eisenberg was like one of the characters in his own cartoons. Mock pedantry was definitely his shtick. You couldn't tell when he was serious and when he wasn't. He'd explain something like the spook theory, or in the driest professorial tone, like an arcane point of real linguistics. The what theory? The idea that spooch is an inherently funny word in the phonetic level. The double O sound is inherently funny. This sort of slides you in there, and the hard ch traps you inside the word so that ooh can resonate until it reaches the humor threshold. A soft sound at the end and you'd escape. That's why spoon isn't funny, but spooch is." I snickered. Jim took another sip of his drink and said, "You see? That proves it. Or that's what Joe used to say. And he had lots more where that came from." "Weird." "Yeah, but creative people are allowed to be weird. The same secret committee that issues the bifocals assigns weirdness quotas, and underground comic book artists get more than most people, and Joe was fun that way. We had locked him in the refrigerator and forgotten about him sometime back in the 30s, so here he was. The part too, like a dark-haired version of Harpo. Somewhere he went too far, and the silliness turned into craziness of a less pleasant sort. I think it began about a year after he'd started working for me. One evening in December, I was still prosperous then and lived in the suburbs, and Joe and I used to go home on the same train. We had been working late over some storyboards. It was beginning of Joe's Miracles at St. Toad series that later got such a tremendous response and Zipperhead funnies. He had the art wrapped in a plastic trash can liner under one arm, and we ran from the train, the wind and rain blasting in our faces. I reached the entrance first, and I could hear the train rumbling in downstairs. We would have made it, but Joe suddenly called out, "Jim, help!" He'd spilled the artwork, all of it, half inside the doorway, half out. Rain splattered over the floor. Late commuters rushed in, not too careful where they stepped. I ran back and helped him cover it, but by then several panels had been ruined. They'd have to be redone. We missed the train and had to wait another hour inside the station. Much of that time was spent drying the storyboards with paper towels from the men's room. "Well, how the hell did you drop them off?" I asked. "Oh," he said, digging into his coat pocket. "Here's why." He held up a penny. "You know what they say? See a penny, pick it up. All day long you'll have good luck." "That was real dumb," I said. "Grade A, idiota maximus. You're running to catch a train in the rain, and you're carrying art that took you days or even weeks to produce, And you risk it all for one crummy cent? Not what I would call sound financial planning. My dear fellow, not at all. He went on for a minute, drawing a spot where the ink had run badly. Then he gave me his best Harpo smile and said, "It isn't the money, Jimbo, it's more luck. If I don't have luck, I might lapse into superstition, which is really bad luck. It's where I get my inspiration from. I found that out. It works like this. You have to find at least one penny every day. That's basic recognition from the gods." The gods? Yeah, Zeus and all that crowd. Nobody sacrifices oxen or goes to oracles anymore, so this is how they stay in touch with the few remaining faithful. Uh-huh. Like I said, you find one penny a day, and that's a sign that at least nothing disastrous will happen. Find more, or dimes or quarters, and you're 10 times blessed, or 25 times, and things will turn out real nice. Find a bright, shiny penny, and something new will come into your life, while an old, tarnished thing means that you'll find something or do something which is old and familiar, but still good. It's a form of divination, I suppose. There are lots of ramifications. I could go on for hours. He proceeded to do so. He explained away the accident with the art by the fact that he hadn't yet picked up a penny that day, and so was sailing under a curse, so to speak. But the evening would be better. He would probably get a lot of work done, or inherit money from a long-lost uncle, or hear from his old girlfriend or something. The penny foretold it. He had a whole system worked out, as elaborate as anything in an astrology manual, and he was absolutely serious as he explained it all. In the station, while waited, then on the train, all the way to his stop. Any other time it might have been hilarious, but I was thinking about deadlines and distributors and the sort of scene my then wife Carol was going to cause when I got home late and her special organic dinner was cold. "Christ, Joe," I said at last. "I don't have time for this bullshit." He turned to me, a hurt look on his face. "It isn't bullshit," he said quietly. Before I could say anything, the train arrived at a stop, and he got up and left. Things got rapidly weirder after that, but I didn't care because Joe was hot. He was turning in great stuff. Before long, I gave him his own book. St. Toad's cracked chimes, and by the time the 3rd issue was out and the returns were in on the 1st, I knew we had hit. If he had discovered the secret of success by picking up pennies on the street, well, all I could say was more power to him. It's hard for me to think of any scene in what was left of his life that didn't have a penny in it. I mean, he found them everywhere. In a dark alley, during the blackout. For God's sake, he stopped, bent over, and said, "Ah, here we go." That summer, we went to a comic art convention in Boston. 2 of us shared the taxi from the train station to the hotel, and sure enough, there was a penny on the floor in front of him. He held it up to the window, doing his best Harpo act, and, true to character, whipped out an oversized magnifying glass and began to scrutinize the coin minutely. "What do you expect to find on it? The secret of the ages?" I asked. "Something like that, Jimbo. Joe was a big success with fans, and he could be a real charmer when he wanted to be, but he got a lot of odd looks anyways, bending over to pick up pennies. There were a lot of jokes about how badly I paid my artists, that they had to scrounge change to stay alive, and once in the middle of the panel discussion, all the microphones went dead. Joe calmly unscrewed the top of his, shook it, and a penny dropped onto the tabletop. He gave the audience his trademark grin, and there was nervous laughter as if most people didn't get the joke. "There's a fortune written on it," he told me. "It says you will find true love and get laid." I got a laugh, and, the prediction came true, at least in part. There was a groupie in the audience who used Joe's shtick to bait him, literally. She laid out a trail of pennies up a flight of stairs along a corridor and under the door of her room. The door was unlocked, and that, to make a steamy story short, is how Joe Eisenberg lost his virginity at the age of 27, because the gods had revealed that he would, he told me afterward. I'm sure glad I picked up that penny, he said. I think he used his silliness to hide social awkwardness, and somewhere along the line, all this very much ceased to be amusing. He found I don't know how many pennies during the remainder of the convention, and on the train ride back, the way he pounced on them told me that totally overdone gag was turning into a mania. It was a wonder he didn't walk into people, and he always was scanning the room looking for pennies. All right. Enough of this, I told him in my best Graham Chapman as a British Army officer voice. This has got to stop. It's getting silly. I only wish it were, Jimbo, he said softly, then turned to stare out the train window. It was early November when he came into my office one evening late with a stack of new artwork. Things were going badly for me by then, for all Joe's stuff sold better than anything else I had. Mid-70s were bad times for undergrounds. Sex and obscenity had lost a good deal of their novelty, and the moron majority was after us. Head shops were closing, and with them went much of the distribution. Books that had sold 75,000 copies 5 years previously were now lucky to do 20,000. And so I was living in that dingy office above the record store and on South Street. My suburban apartment and my wife, Carol, had gone in course of belt-tightening. I was working late with some bills, and Joe knew I'd be there. He had a key, and he just came in. Hardly glanced up. Just as he stepped through the door, my Selectric jammed and began making a hideous row. Somehow he was expecting it. Joe dropped his artwork on a chair and ran to my desk, leaning over my shoulder, reaching into my typewriter with the longest pair of tweezers I have ever laid eyes on, and extracted, you don't have to guess, a shiny, new, get damn penny from the innards of my typewriter. As soon as he did, the machine reverted to a contented hum. Out came the magnifying glass again. I knew better than to expect an explanation. This is great, he said, in something that was almost a tone of reverential awe. The pattern is complete. I have all the answers now. Without another word, he left, not bothering to even discuss the artwork, but, as I said, I was pretty used to his eccentricities by now. So I just got up and looked at the art myself, and in a minute, I'd forgotten my troubles. How weird Joe was getting and everything. Stuff was brilliant. It was the first of the final sequence of the St. Toad strips, in which the warty sage sets out on his pilgrimage to find the meaning of life in the land of reversible cups. I was laughing out loud. It was a breakthrough which put Joe on a level with the immortal Arkrum, or even a notch above. Wow, I said to myself. Mr. Natural Move Over. It was part of a sustained burst of creativity on Joe's part. I didn't see him much after that. He sent his stuff in by Federal Express. There was enough there to keep St. Toad going for several years. Weird, metaphysical stuff, all full of dooms and prophecies, and some of his predictions were just uncanny as things turned out. You know, about the World Series and Comet Tech and the president's brain. There were pennies in every panel. It became trademarked again to see where he had hidden them. Even in the Fantastic Voyage parody sequence, where the hero sells a tiny submarine up his own asshole, if you look very closely, there's an Indian headset lodged in the pancreas. It was completely impossible for me to think of Joe Eisenberg without thinking of pennies, and vice versa. My God, I told myself, he must have buckets of them by now. By the time the following January came around, the sales of Joe's work were all that was keeping my operation afloat, so you can understand my alarm when I tried to call him one day and got a recorded message saying his phone had been disconnected. It was a mistake, I told myself, or maybe he had just forgotten to pay the bill. I sent him a letter, certified, so he'd have to come to the door and sign for it. The letter was returned undeliverable. There was another Joe Eisenberg shtick that came to mind, mock childish eagerness over the question. Can we panic now? Huh? Can we? Yes, I thought. We can panic now. I decided to pay him a visit. It was raining that evening as I walked to the train station. I couldn't help but to think of the night when the penny mania had all begun. Joe Doubt would have called it a sign from the gods, a meaningful symmetry or something. There was a discarded newspaper on the seat behind me as the train pulled out of 30th Street and headed for the suburbs. I glanced at the familiar scenes for a while, then picked up the paper. It was a back section, and there, under a snide headline, was a piece about a local character, the pennyman, who spent whole days wandering the streets after loose change and bulging pockets of his old overcoat jangling. For all there was, no photo and no names were mentioned. I knew it was Joe. Oh, shit, I muttered to myself, crumpling a newspaper. Oh, shit. Joe lived in one of the few sleazy side streets in the posh mainline town of Bryn Mawr, in an upstairs apartment over a drugstore. I went up the back stairs, wooden stairs outside the building, and tapped gently on his door. No answer. I peered through the glass. The apartment was dark. It was just my luck. Maybe he was out picking up pennies again, hoping to find the secret of the universe that way. In my state of mind, I didn't doubt that he could actually do it, or else the pennies had revealed that he should move without telling me. I was ready to believe anything. I heard slow, shuffling footsteps, a metallic clang, and the sound of coins pouring onto the floor, followed by incoherent obscenities, but I knew that tired, almost sobbing voice. He opened the door, then lunged for my feet. I jumped back, startled. He picked up a penny off the mat, looked at it, and put it in his pocket and turned to go back inside. Not yet, he said to himself. A little more time. He made the door shut, and as if he hadn't noticed me at all. Joe, aren't you going to ask me in? Hello, Jim, he said, a little disoriented. I got a good look at him then. I hardly recognized him. Now, you'll recall that there were still a lot of hippies then, and squalor hadn't totally fallen into disfavor yet, but Joe had gone beyond acceptable limits. It was a cold, damp winter night, and there he was, barefoot, wearing old jeans, with both knees out, and bathrobe held shut with safety pins. He hadn't shaved in at least a week, and he smelled like he hadn't bathed in twice that, and he was haggard. His face pale and sunken, his eyes bloodshot, his gaze bald and distracted like a crazy man's. Like the look you see on bad people when they sit for hours in a corner somewhere, staring into nothing. How are you, Joe? Jimbo. I knew you would come by eventually. I suppose you deserve an explanation. Come in. So I followed him silently along an unlighted corridor, stepping over boxes and piles of papers. The studio was a mess, paint chipping from the walls, trash in the cardboard boxes heaped in corners, orange peels on the floor. Something moved behind the boxes. Maybe it was a cat, maybe not. I wondered how he could work here. The only window looked out on the brick wall. The overhead light apparently didn't work, so the only illumination came from a small lamp he'd clamped onto his drawing table. I waded forward, careful not to step on any artwork, and looked at the drawing on the table. It was a rough pencil sketch of the opening spread for what turned out to be the final issue of St. Toad. The scene where they sacrificed a little Nell to Odin. I was selfishly relieved to see that, for all Joe Eisenberg might be going mad, his creative powers were not failing. His stuff would continue to sell comic books. Still, Joe didn't say anything. I turned away from the table and began to scan the bookshelves, reading titles as best I could in the gloom. You can tell a lot about someone by what is on their bookshelves. Joe was full of surprises. There were lots of comics and the hardcover reprints of the EC classics, but also lots of classics in the literary sense. He had most of the Elizabethans and even Latin and Greek writers, and there were scholarly books on religion, folklore, magic, that sort of thing. I could only make out a few titles. A Thousand Faces, the Joshi translation of Al-Azif, and a few more. Not what you'd expect for the average cartoonist, of course. Joe wasn't the average cartoonist. His strips were fantastically lurid sometimes. "Jim," he said at last, "you are probably wondering." "You could say that." "I'll bet you have." Then he bent over, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. All along one wall was a row of buckets, and they were indeed filled with pennies. He picked up a handful of them and let them dribble through his fingers. "See a penny? Pick it up. All day long you'll have good luck. Do you know what the next verse is, Jimbo?" "No, but I think you're going to tell me." "See a penny, leave and lay. Death claim you that same day." I learned that from the penny elves. That's one of the many things they told me. "The what kind of elves?" "Penny elves. Jim, like tooth fairies, who have been promoted, only they're not good enough to work for Santa Claus. I used to think it was the old gods, and that was a grand and serene, beautiful way to look at it. The Olympian powers exiled, forgotten, reduced to communicating to the few mortals who still acknowledge them by penny divination. There's a certain pathos in the idea, but it isn't true. It's all the work of these loser elves. They resent the job. They want the prestige of being in the employ of the big class, but they know they haven't made the grade, so they put us humans through the paces just to make us look ridiculous. They bait the trap with real knowledge, real predictions, and lead us on." He said all of this with such conviction, such passive yet intense resignation, that the effect was scary. I can't put it any other way. Is this like the spooch theory, Joe? Suddenly, he was angry. I'd never seen him angry before. He threw the remaining pennies down hard and started shooing me toward the door. "Forget it, Jimbo. You keep asking me if I can be serious. Well, you can't. That's pretty obvious. You won't understand. Don't worry about your damn artwork. You'll get it on time. What you need to worry about is, what are you going to do when this starts happening to you, huh, Jimbo? What?" He slammed the door in my face. I stood there for a minute at the top of the stairs, stunned, and then I headed for the Bryan Moore train station. There was nothing I could do. I never felt so hopeless in all my life. Joe had no family that I knew of, and I couldn't very well spend $75 an hour, even if I had it, explaining to a shrink that I had this friend who was suffering from extraordinary delusions. I was laughed. Call up the police and tell them Joe was behaving irrationally? There are lots of irrational people in our society, and nobody cares a bit about them. You see them in every big city, sleeping on the vents. So I caught the last train back into Philly and did nothing. I was disturbed to notice that there was an unusual amount of loose change on the floor of the train car that I was riding in. Nobody stooped to pick any of it up. Joe Eisenberg was as good as his word. He remained punctual under the end. His work came in on time, as brilliant and wonderful as ever. Somewhere in the deep recesses of his tangled mind, genius still remained. I don't think the word lightly. Genius. My own behavior in the following couple of months was selfish, even shameful. That whole scene had been a cry for help from a very disturbed individual, but I tried to put him out of my mind. He was an adult, I told myself. His own responsibility. I was his publisher, not his daddy. Mostly I retreated into work. When I started out publishing Undergrounds, it was a lark. A mixture of joking and idealism, a way of showing what we called the establishment in those days. That the true spirit of freaky America had not been stifled. I never imagined that it would become a desperate, grinding business, frequently interrupted by messages from the sponsor, that is to say, the landlord, who swore he would turn me and mine out on the sidewalk if the rent was late one more time. Then there were artists. I managed to pay some of them, some of the time. I felt bad about that. Joe never complained. He was faithful till the end. The end came on the last evening of April, while Purgus napped. I suppose that figured. I had been out most of the day trying to find a second-hand typewriter to replace my Selectric, which had rattled and gurgled its last. When I got back to the office, apartment, there was a package between the inner and outer doors, with no markings at all, save a single word scribbled on the back in magic marker. Goodbye. I recognized Joe's handwriting, of course. I hurried inside and slid open the package. Several pennies fell out onto the carpet. The package contained artwork. Another. The final installment of St. Toad's Cracked Times, beginning with the sacrifice scene I'd seen on his drawing table during my visit. Well, fine, I thought. He's delivering them by himself. Then the phone rang. It was the printer, who wasn't going to print the next zipperhead unless I paid him for the jobs he'd done on the previous 4. As soon as I got myself out of that one, another artist called and threatened to go on strike if I didn't pay him what I owed him. One thing followed another, and I didn't manage to even think of Joe until quite late that night. I must have been around 11 when I noticed that one of the coins on the rug was much larger than the others. I picked it up. It wasn't an American penny, but a very old, large-sized British one with Queen Victoria on the front. On the back were the words, "Watch this space for further developments." I dropped it with a yelp as if it were red hot. I was sure I was seeing things going a bit mad myself. The coin lay on the rug at my feet, the message fading in and out. Watch. 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 The phone rang one more time. I assumed it was another creditor. It's never too late at night when people are after you for money. "Hello," I snarled. It was Joe. He sounded exhausted, his voice cracking as he spoke. I think he had been crying. "Jim," he said, "you've been good to me, as good as anyone. I think you ought to know. It's too late to do anything for me, but I ought to tell you the truth." There was a long pause, as if he couldn't bring himself to speak. "What is it, Joe?" I asked him gently. "You can tell me." "It isn't elves. There are no such things as penny elves." I hoped that somehow Joe had snapped out of it, had become sane again, but he didn't sound any saner. If anything, he sounded worse. "It's devils," he said. "Devils right out of hell. Special subdivision of them. They work for Mammon, the demon of avarice, and they lead people to damnation through, well, money. I made a pact with them, Jim. I did it before I knew how and who they really were. It all started as a game, picking up pennies, tying them into coincidences, pretending that they were omens and prophecies, but then, somehow, I discovered that they really were. Hidden knowledge, Jim. That's what it was. They told me all sorts of things. Wonderful, terrible. I made a deal. I wanted to be good, Jim. I wanted to be the best, so I made a deal. And I learned how to read the signs more closely than ever before. That's where my inspiration came from, St. Toad. all the rest. Made in hell. You know what they say about me? Devilishly funny. No, Joe, I said. This is crapola. It's you. You're a genius. It comes out of your head. You didn't get it off the back of any stupid penny. The back, Jimmo? How did you know the message is always on the back? I never told you that. I looked down at the coin on the rug. There on the back of it was something new. Joe is dying. Joe, I said. Don't do anything. Stay where you are. I'm coming out there right now. I appreciate the thought, my friend, but you can't help me. They're coming for me tonight. They're coming to collect on an old debt. They told me this on the last penny I found. He babbled for a while after that. I could barely make out one word in 5. Then he was weeping and reciting poetry. Cut is the branch that might have grown full straight, and burned as Apollo's laurel bough that sometime grew within this learned man. Faustus is gone, regard his hellish fall, whose fiendful fortune may exhort the wise. I'm coming out there, he said, and hung up on him. I ran for the train station only to find when I got there that I had missed the last train. I was desperate. I would have to take a cab, but then I realized I didn't have enough money on me. The floor of the train station was littered with coins, which no one else seemed to notice. I paced calmly, kicking hundreds of nickels and dimes this way and that. I didn't look at any of them. They burned in my hands as I gathered them, but after a few minutes I had my pockets full, just like the penny man the newspaper writer had found so amusing. It was a long ride to Moor. I didn't even bother to ask the cabbie why there was so much loose change on the floor in the back of the cab. Something scratched beneath the seat, and I thought I caught a whiff of sulfur. This same cabbie was more surprised than angry when I paid my $15 fare with a double handful of coins. You count it, I yelled as I ran out and up the stairs to Joe's apartment. There was a thunderous racket coming from the alley beneath the studio window. Coins were pouring out, rattling off the tops of trash cans like rainwater. When I got to his door, the sound from inside was like what you'd hear if every slot machine in Atlantic City hit the jackpot at once. Of course, I was too late. He was already dead by the time I forced open the door and crawled the length of that hall through 3 or 4 feet of loose change, which seemed to wriggle and heave beneath me, while millions of coins poured out of the darkness overhead, battering, nearly suffocating me. I think Joe had been trying to draw at the very end. His table was still standing, and there were a few random lines across a sheet of paper clamped there. His stool was buried, and I dug frantically. I found him at last, face down on the floor, half underneath the drawing table, and I pulled him to the surface and clung to him as if somehow that would do some good, but he was already dead. I just sat there for a while as the coins rained down. The whole structure of the building creaked from the weight of them, and my mind blanked out. His corpse was a kind of life preserver, and I hung on because I couldn't let go. I was still holding him when the police arrived. Jim Bowen stopped talking and took another sip of his drink. My Wangadanga burger had gotten cold on my plate. The waitress was staring at us. That's the story, he said. I don't expect you to believe it, but that's the story. Wait a damn minute, I said, almost convinced I was the victim of the most inscrutable poker face put on in history. You can't end it there. I mean, the police find you half buried in something like $40 million worth of small change, and Joe Eisenberg is in your arms, crushed to death. You must have had quite a time explaining. He wasn't crushed. He choked on a single coin. Otherwise, The apartment was its usual mess. All those pennies were gone. Except the one he'd choked on. That wasn't a penny, Chuck. That was a solidus. What? An ancient Roman coin. Gold. About the size of a nickel. The figure on it was Julian, the apostate, who was the last emperor to honor the old gods. He was heavily into divination, I understand. But what has that got to do with? I think the devil, or whatever they are, thought it would make a particularly fine finishing touch. That's all. It was embedded in his esophagus. The doctor showed it to me after the autopsy. I didn't know what to say next. Jim Bowen seemed so sincere about all this. And as he put it, that was the scary part. I rose to leave. I suppose it was about that time, Jim said. The waitress came with our checks on a little tray. I reached for my wallet, but Jim said, "No, you listen to my story, and so I'm going to treat you." He put some bills down, and the waitress took them away. Then he picked up his napkin. There were coins under it, nickels, dimes, but mostly pennies. He recoiled in disgust as if the tabletop were covered with live spiders. "What are you going to do with this? What are you going to do when this starts happening to you?" Joe Eisenberg had supposedly asked. Jim was clearly wondering. So was I. Just a little bit. I thought he was going to faint, but instead, very gingerly, he brushed the tabletop clear. The waitress came back, offering him a little tray. "For God's sake, keep the change." The Hound by H.P. Lovecraft. Did I already say The Hound by H.P. Lovecraft? Sorry, I had to drink some water because my throat was getting a bit raw. Alright, here we go. I don't know if you guys know Lovecraft, but he was quite a sick and tortured individual, and I really love I enjoy his work. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. Once more, The Hound by H.P. Lovecraft. In my tortured ears, there sounds unceasingly a nightmare whirring and flapping and a faint, distant bang, as of some gigantic hound. It is not a dream. It is not a fear, even madness. For too much has already happened to give me these merciful doubts. St. John is a mingled corpse. I alone know why, and such is my knowledge that I am about to blow out my brains with fear I shall be mangled in the same way. Down unlit and illimitable corridors of eldritch fantasy sweeps black, shapeless nemesis that drives me self-annihilation. May heaven forgive the folly and morbidity which led us both to so monstrous a fate. Wearied with the commonplaces of a prosaic world, where even the boys of romance and adventure soon grow stale, St. John and I had followed enthusiastically every aesthetic and intellectual movement which promised respite from our devastating ennui. The enigmas of the symbolists and the ecstasies of the pre-Raphaelites all were ours in their time. But each new mood was drained too soon of its diverting novelty and appeal. Only the somber philosophy of the decadents could hold us, and this we found potent only by increasing gradually the depth and diabolism of our penetrations. Baudelaire and Huysmans were soon exhausted of thrills, till finally there remained for us only the more direct stimuli of unnatural personal experiences and adventures. was this frightful emotional need which led us eventually to that detestable corpse, which, even in my present fear, I mention with shame and timidity. That hideous extremity of human outrage and abhorred practice of grave robbing. I cannot reveal the details of our shocking expeditions, or catalog even partly the worst of the trophies adorning the nameless museum we prepared in Great Stone House where we jointly dwelt, alone and servantless. Our museum was a blasphemous, unthinkable place where, with a satanic taste of neurotic virtuosi, we had assembled an universe of terror and decay to excite our jaded sensibilities. It was a secret room, far, far underground, where huge winged daemons carved of basalt and onyx vomited from wide grinning mouths, weird green and orange light, and hidden pneumatic pipes ruffled into kaleidoscopic dances of death. The lines of red charnel things had in hand, woven in voluminous black hangings. Through these pipes came at will the odors of our moods most grave, sometimes the scent of pale funeral lilies, sometimes the narcotic incense of imagined eastern shrines of kingly dead, and sometimes, how I shudder to recall it, the frightful soul upheaving stenches of the uncovered grave. Around the walls of this chamber were cases of antique mummies, alternating with comely, lifelike bodies perfectly stuffed and cured by the taxidermist's art, and with the headstones snatched from the oldest churchyards of the world. Okay, hold on, guys. I gotta check the volume on this. It seems a little loud. Yeah, I'm gonna turn it down just a smidge. Okay, let's get back to it. Hold on, I gotta find it. Where was I? Okay. Around the walls of this repellent chamber were cases of antique mummies alternating with comely, lifelike bodies perfectly stuffed and cured. Yes, we read that. Niches here and there contained skulls of all shapes, and heads preserved in various stages of dissolution. There one might find the rotting bald pates of famous noblemen, and the fresh and radiantly golden heads of new buried children. Statues and paintings there were, all of fiendish subjects, and some executed by St. John and myself. A locked portfolio bound in tanned human skin held certain unknown and unnameable drawings which it is rumored Goya had perpetrated but dared not acknowledge. There were nauseous musical instruments, stringed brass and woodwind, on which St. John and I sometimes produced dissonances of exquisite morbidity and cocodamoniacal ghastliness, whilst in a multitude of inlaid ebony cabinets reposed the most incredible and unimaginable variety of tumult ever assembled by human madness and perversity. It is of this loot, in particular, that I must not speak. Thank God I had the courage to destroy it long before I thought of destroying myself. The predatory excursions on which we collected our unmentionable treasures were always artistically memorable events. We were no vulgar fools, but worked only under certain conditions of mood, landscape, environment, weather, season, and moonlight. These pastimes were to us the most exquisite form of aesthetic expression, and we gave their details of fastidious expression, fastidious technical care, an inappropriate hour, a jarring lighting effect, or a clumsy manipulation of the damp sod would almost totally destroy for us that ecstatic titillation which followed the exhumation of some ominous, grinning secret of the earth. Our quest for novel scenes and piquant conditions was feverish and insatiate. St. John was always the leader, and he it was who led the way at last to that mocking, that accursed spot which brought us our hideous and inevitable doom. By what malign fatality were we lured to that terrible Holland churchyard? I think it was the dark rumor and legendary that tells of our buried for 5 centuries, who had himself been a ghoul in his time and had stolen a potent thing from a mighty sepulchre. I can recall the scene in these final moments, the pale autumnal moon over the graves, casting long horrible shadows, the grotesque trees drooping sullenly to meet the neglected grass, and the crumbling slabs. The vast legions of strangely colossal bats that flew against the moon, the antique ivied church pointing a huge spectral finger at the livid sky, the phosphorescent insects that danced like death fires under the yews in a distant corner, the odors of mold vegetation and less explicable things that mingled feebly with the night wind from over far swamps and seas, and worst of all, the faint, deep-toned baying of some gigantic hound which we could neither see nor definitely place. As we heard this suggestion of baying, we shuddered, remembering the tales of peasantry. For he whom we sought had centuries before been found in this self-same spot, torn and mangled by the claws and teeth of some unspeakable beast. I remember how we delved in this coarse grave with our spades, and how we thrilled at the picture of ourselves, the grave, the pale watching moon, the horrible shadows, the grotesque trees, the titanic bats, the antique church, dancing death fires, the sickening odors, the gently moaning night wind, and the strange, half-heard, directionless baying of whose objective existence we could scarcely be sure. Then we struck a substance harder than the damp mold, and beheld a rotting oblong box crusted with mineral deposits from the long undisturbed ground. It was incredibly tough and thick, but so old that we finally pried it open and feasted our eyes on what it held. Much, amazingly much, was left the object despite the lapse of 500 years. The skeleton, though crushed in places by the jaws of the thing that had killed it, held together with surprising firmness, and we gloated over the clean white skull and its long, firm teeth and its eyeless sockets that once had glowed with a charnel fever like our own. In the coffin lay an amulet of curious and exotic design, which had apparently been worn around the sleeper's neck. It was the oddly conventionalized figure of a crouching winged hound, or sphinx, with a semi-canine face, and was exquisitely carved in antique oriental fashion from a small piece of green jade. The expression on its features was repellent, in the extreme, savoring at once of death, bestiality, and malevolence. Around the base was an inscription in characters which neither St. John nor I could identify, and on the bottom, like the maker's seal, was graven a grotesque and formidable skull. Immediately upon beholding this amulet, we knew that we must possess it, that this treasure alone was our logical pelf from the centuried grave. Even had its outlines been unfamiliar, we would have desired it, but as we looked more closely, we saw that it was not wholly unfamiliar. Alien it indeed was to all art and literature which sane and balanced readers know, but we recognized it as the thing hinted of in the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. the ghastly soul symbol of the corpse-eating cult of inaccessible Lang in Central Asia. All too well, we did trace the sinister lineaments described by the old Arab demonologist. Lineaments, he wrote, drawn from some obscure supernatural manifestation of the souls of those who vexed and gnawed at the dead. Seizing the green jade object, we gave a last glance at the bleached and cavern-eyed face of its owner, and closed up the grave as we found it. As we hastened from the abhorrent spot, the stolen amulet in St. John's pocket, we thought we saw the bats descend in a body on the earth we had so lately rifled, as if seeking for some cursed and unholy nourishment. But the autumn moon shone weak and pale, and we could not be sure. So too was, as we sailed the next day away from Holland to our home, we thought we heard the faint distant baying of some gigantic hound in the background, but the autumn wind moaned sad in one, and we could not be sure. 2. Less than a week after our return to England, strange things began to happen. We lived as recluses, devoid of friends, alone and without servants, in a few rooms of an ancient manor house on a bleak and unfrequent moor, so that our doors were seldom disturbed by the knock of the visitor. Now, however, we were troubled by what seemed to be frequent fumblings in the night, not only around the doors but around the windows also, upper as well as lower. Once we fancied that a large opaque body darkened the library window when the moon was shining against it, and another time we thought we heard a whirring or flapping sound not far off. On each occasion, investigation revealed nothing, and we began to ascribe the occurrences to imagination alone, that same curiously disturbed imagination which still prolonged in our ears the faint, far baying we thought we had heard in the Holland churchyard. The jade amulet now reposed in a niche in our museum, and sometimes we burned strangely scented candles before it. We read much in Alhazred's Necronomicon about its properties and about the relation of ghouls, souls to be the objects of symbolized, and were disturbed by what we read. Then terror came. On the night of September 24, 19, whatever, there's just a dash, I heard a knock at my chamber door. Fancying it St. John's, I bade the knocker enter, but was answered only by a shrill laugh. There was no one in the corridor when I aroused St. John from his sleep. He professed entire ignorance of the event and became as worried as I. It was that night that the faint, distant baying over the moor became, to us, a certain and dreaded reality. 4 days later, whilst we were both in the hidden museum, there came a low, cautious scratching at the single door which led to the secret library staircase. Our alarm was now divided, for besides our fear of the unknown, we had always entertained a dread that our grisly collection might be discovered. Extinguishing all lights, we proceeded to the door and threw it suddenly open, whereupon we felt an unaccountable rush of air, and heard, as if receding far away, a queer combination of rustling, tittering, and articulate chatter. Whether we were mad, dreaming, or in our senses, we did not try to determine. We only realized, with the blackest of apprehensions, that the apparently disembodied chatter was beyond a doubt in the Dutch language. After that, we lived in growing horror and fascination. Mostly, we held the theory that we were jointly going mad from our life of unnatural excitements, but sometimes it pleased us more to dramatize ourselves as the victims of some creeping and appalling doom. Bizarre manifestations were now too frequent to count. Our lonely house was seemingly alive with the presence of some malign being whose nature we could not guess, and every night that demonic baying rolled over the windswept moor, always louder and louder. On October 29, we found in the soft earth underneath the library window a series of footprints utterly impossible to describe. They were as baffling as the hordes of great bats which haunted the old manor house in unprecedented and increasing numbers. The horror reached a culmination in November 18 when St. John, walking home after dark from the distant railway station, was seized by some frightful carnivorous thing and torn to ribbons. His screams had reached the house, and I had hastened to the terrible scene in time to hear a whir of wings and see a vague black cloudy thing silhouetted against the rising moon. My friend was dying when I spoke to him, and he could not answer coherently. All he could do was to whisper, "The amulet, a damn thing." Then he collapsed, an inert mass of mingled flesh. I buried him the next midnight in one of our neglected gardens and mumbled over his body one of the devilish rituals he had loved in life, and as I pronounced the last demonic sentence, I heard afar on the moor the faint baying of some gigantic hound. The moon was up, but I dared not look at it, and when I saw on the dim-lit moor a wide nebulous shadow sweeping from mound to mound, I shut my eyes and threw myself face down upon the ground. When I arose trembling, I know not how much later, I staggered into the house and made shocking obeisances before the enshrined amulet of green jade. Being now afraid to live alone in the ancient house on the moor, I departed on the following day for London, taking with me the amulet after destroying by fire and burial the rest of the impious collection in the museum. But after 3 nights I heard the baying again, and before a week was over, felt strange eyes upon me whenever it was dark. One evening, as I strolled on Victoria Embankment for some needed air, I saw a black shape obscure one of the reflections of the lamps in the water. A wind stronger than the night wind rushed by, and I knew that what I had befallen St. John must soon befall me. The next day I carefully wrapped the green jade amulet and sailed for Holland. What mercy I might gain by returning this thing to its silent sleeping owner I knew not, but I felt that I must at least try and step conceivably logical. What the hound was, and why it pursued me, were questions still vague, but I had first heard the baying in the ancient churchyard, and every subsequent event, including St. John's dying whisper, had served to connect the curse with the stealing of the amulet. Accordingly, I sank into nethermost abysses of despair when, at an inn in Rotterdam, I discovered that thieves had despoiled me of this sole means of salvation. The baying was loud that evening, and in the morning I read of a nameless deed in the vilest quarter of the city. The rabble were in terror, for upon an evil tenement had fallen a red death beyond the foulest previous crime of the neighborhood. In a squalid thieves' den, an entire family had been torn to shreds by an unknown thing which left no trace, and those around had heard all night, above the usual clamor of drunken voices, a faint, deep, insistent note as of a gigantic hound. Okay, hold on. So at last I stood again in that unwholesome churchyard where a pale winter moon cast hideous shadows, and leafless trees drooped solemnly to meet the withered, frosty grass and cracked slabs, and the ivied church pointed a jeering finger at the unfriendly sky, and the night wind howled maniacally from over frozen swamps and frigid seas. The baying was very faint now, and it ceased altogether as I approached the ancient grave I had once violated, and frightened away an abnormally large horde of bats which had been hovering curiously around it. I know not why I went thither unless I pray or gibber out insane pleas and apologies to the calm white thing that lay within, but whatever my reason, I attacked half-frozen sod with a desperation partly mine and partly that of a dominating will outside of myself. Excavation was much easier than I expected, though at one point I encountered a queer interruption, when a lean vulture darted down out of the cold sky and pecked frantically at the grave earth until I killed him with a blow of my spade. Finally, I reached the rotting oblong box and removed the damp nitrous cover. This is the last rational act I ever performed. For crouched within that centuried coffin, embraced by a close-packed nightmare retinue of huge, sinewy, sleeping bats, was the bony thing my friend and I had robbed. Not a clean and placid as we had seen it then, but covered with caked blood and shreds of alien flesh and hair, and leering sentiently at me with the phosphorescent sockets and sharp, ensanguined fangs yawning twistedly in mockery of my inevitable doom. And when it gave from those grinning jaws a deep, sardonic bay as of some gigantic hound, and I saw that it held in its gory, filthy claw the lost and fateful amulet of green jade, I merely screamed and ran away idiotically, my screams soon dissolving into peals of hysterical laughter. Madness rise the star wind, claws and teeth sharpened on centuries of corpses, dripping death astride a canoe of bats from night-black ruins of buried temples of Belial. Now as the baying of that dead, fleshless monstrosity grows louder and louder, and the stealthy whirring and flapping of those accursed web wings circles closer and closer, I shall seek with my revolver the oblivion which is my only refuge from the unnamed and unnameable. The Duke of Demolition Goes to Hell by John Gregory Betancourt. So this is hell, Big Jim Karnak, the self-proclaimed Duke of Demolition, thought to himself. He remembered dying. He remembered the sterile smell of the hospital with so many doctors and nurses looming over him, so many fruit bowls and flower baskets and potted plants oh so tastefully arranged around the room. Reality had gotten a little weird at the end. He drifted through a painkiller haze as endless streams of relatives and business associates trooped through for one last look. They had no hope. He saw it in their eyes. They knew he was terminal. He knew he was terminal. Cancer was like that. It was just a matter of time. Don Esmond, his junior partner in the construction and demolition business for the last 8 years, the kid he'd brought in straight from business school to handle the financial side when the company got too big, shoved his young, tanned, sickeningly healthy face close to Big Jim's. So this is it, Esmond whispered with a rictus grin. I get it all, old man. Hurry up and die, will you? My wife and kids are waiting in the car. I don't deserve this, Big Jim thought, but all the arguments had long ago leaked out of him. He merely closed his eyes. When he opened them again, Esmond was gone. That was the last thing that he remembered. The next thing he knew, he was walking along a twilight street. Victorian mansions with huge front lawns and wrought iron fences faced him from both sides, looking not run down but new, like they must have been at their prime. The soft yellow glow of oil lamps spilled from their windows. So this is hell, Big Jim said again, this time aloud. He gave a low chuckle. His fate had a certain ironic quality. These were the houses he'd torn down his whole life, decaying relics of bygone days when coal had been cheap and tin-room houses, the middle-class standard huge, drafty, inefficient monoliths to a lifestyle which no longer existed. He'd enjoyed destroying them. Was that his sin? He'd made a career of buying Victorian mansions, abandoned by their owners, too run down to renovate. They went cheaply at public auctions. His men moved in like a swarm of farmy ants, stripping everything salvageable. Big Jim had an eye for art. Stained glass was a prized plum. Lead-glass fixtures, old tile, old brick, oak floorboards. It all ended up recycled into the new houses. A touch of old-time class, his company built on the foundations of the old. He squeezed every penny out of a mansion's corpse before laying it in its grave. In the old days, before he started his construction company, had been just demolition and salvage. He'd worked 15-hour days with non-union kids he hired at minimum wage. He'd operated the wrecking ball himself, and he'd enjoyed the work, enjoyed the slow, ponderous motion of the ball as it swung back, gathered speed, then slammed into a building with killer force. He'd raised demolition to an art form, shattering walls without caving in roofs, loosening mortar without pulverizing bricks, knocking out windows one by one. It brought an almost sexual fulfillment, a sense of satisfaction like no other. Was that so terrible? He thought back to his wife, to his son and twin daughters. They'd seemed happy. He'd given them everything they wanted or needed. A nice home, a swimming pool, Catholic schools, 2 dogs, and a cat, a car for each of them. Sure, they'd had fights and arguments, but what family didn't? And when his son came to the hospital that last day, Big Jim could have sworn there were tears in his eyes. All past sins had been washed away, forgiven. They'd been friends. And his wife, Big Jim knew it, had broken her heart to see him in the hospital, slipping farther away each day, but that hadn't been his fault, had it? And his daughters, sobbing in the corner as he made lame jokes. If there'd been any other way, if sewer slide hadn't been a sin. Perhaps it had been his business dealings that brought him to hell. Big Jim thought uneasily. He tried to run an honest company, but he'd paid his share of graft, and the construction and demolition business floated on under-the-table cash. Even so, he'd never stabbed any partners in the back, literally and figuratively, never stolen, never cheated on his taxes, never done anything overtly illegal. All he'd done was tear down old houses and put up nice new ones. What had he done to end up in hell? What if it's not hell? He wondered suddenly. What if it's all been a dream? My dying, everything? He stopped and held up his hands. They'd been yellow-gray and liver-spotted with age in the hospital. He'd been 63 after all, not young anymore, but these hands. He turned them over and over in the dim light. These hands looked young, healthy, like the hands he'd had in school. Reincarnation? He wondered. Amnesia? Shadows flickered in the windows of the Victorian opposite him. Had a person moved inside, or was it a trick of the light? Big Jim hesitated. He knew he couldn't spend the rest of eternity wandering aimlessly. Better to check out the house than stand in the street and guess. Having a plan made him feel better. He opened the Victorian's gate, strode up the brick walkway, then climbed the porch steps one by one. Stumbling on the top step, he almost fell. A loose board had caught his foot, he realized. Be careful, he chided himself. He was used to Victorians. He knew how treacherous they became when they were old and decaying. Several of his workmen had fallen through rotted-out floors, or had walls unexpectedly cave in on them. Oh no! No way. It's not time yet. We still have 8 minutes. Sorry, guys. Dang it. That scared me. I was like, no way. I was just getting into it. Alright. Having a plan made him feel better. He opened the Victorian's gate, strode up to the brick walkway, then climbed the porch steps one by one. Be careful, he chided himself. He was used to Victorians. He knew how treacherous they became when they were old and decaying. Several of his workmen had fallen. He knocked, paused a minute, knocked again. No answer came. When he tested the knob, though, it turned easily. He pushed the door open with his fingertips. A needle-like pain jabbed his index finger, and he jerked his hand back with a startled cry. "Ah!" he muttered. "Damn splinter!" He pulled it out with his teeth, spat it away, then stumped in. The place was deserted. Not a stick of furniture anywhere. Varnished oak floorboards creaked underfoot. The cold draft touched his cheek. The place felt like nobody had been inside in years, even though a flame flickered in the old-fashioned oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. Big Jim shivered. It was cold in here. Crossing to the huge cast-iron radiator, he reached out cautiously. He didn't feel any radiating heat. When he bent to check the valve, though, it burned his hand. He leaped back, cursing out loud this time, nursing burned fingers. Another draft touched him. The house seemed to exhale like it was alive. Alive? Big Jim backed toward the door as dust began to sift down from the ceiling. The place seemed to exude hatred, he thought, as though it wanted to collapse on him, as though it wanted to kill him. He ran for the door, made it through, didn't stop for the porch steps, but leaped over them. On the brick walkway, he came to a sudden stop. A wrecking machine now sat directly in front of him. It hadn't been there when he entered the house, nor had he heard it drive up. It must be a trick of some kind, he thought. He circled the machine cautiously. Its huge, stabilizing feet had been lowered and locked into place, spread out in a huge X to brace against movements of the wrecking ball. The ball itself, a 500-pound steel slug at the end of a chain, hung from a 40-foot-tall steel tower. The door at the operator's cabin had Karnak Demolition stenciled across it. Big Jim climbed onto the tractor tread, then the stepping rung. The cab door opened easily. He slid into the padded bucket seat. The smells of plastic and new rubber surrounded him. A manila folder lay across the controls. He flicked on the cab's light, opened the folder, and began to read. James House, 1884 to 1973. December 8th, 1884, leaking roof ruined, 473 book library. January 14th, 1885, child broke leg on steps. January 19, 1885, clogged flue-filled house with smoke. February 2nd, 1885, ceiling fixture fell, injuring woman. March 17, 1885, maid slipped on wet kitchen floor. March 24, 1885. It was a list of house sins, Big Jim Karnak realized. He leafed through page after page of petty annoyances, broken pipes, leaking gas valves, rotting wood, lots of burns and splinters and minor injuries for the people who lived there. The house had even killed. An old woman fell down the second-floor steps and broke her neck in 1904. It killed again in 1951. a teenage girl who slipped in the bathtub hit her head on the sink. As Big Jim scanned the entries, he got a sense of the house's true nature. It wanted to hurt people, he realized, to make their lives as miserable as it could. He thought of the stumble he'd taken on the front steps, of the splinter the door had given him, of the burn he'd received from the radiator, even when it wasn't radiating heat. Pettiness irked him. The house needed to be punished, he thought, and he was just the man to do it. He turned the key on the wrecking machine's ignition. The engine purred to life. He changed gears. The steel ball began to swing back. Big Jim knew then why he'd ended up in hell. It wasn't a punishment. He'd come to render justice. Throughout his life, he'd specialized in destroying Victorians. They must fear me, he thought. I must be their worst nightmare. He revved the motor. The house began to scream even before the wrecking ball struck. Oh my goodness, you guys. That was a good story to end on. Perfectly in time for the next story. But I just want to thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight on VR Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. It was a pleasure hanging out with you and hopefully entertaining you. I really don't want to annoy you. I want it to be our best time together. Thank you to all of my friends out there, wherever you may be listening, Beyond the Omniverse tonight. I had a wonderful time and I can't wait to do it again tomorrow night. I feel like I should do one tomorrow night because I missed last night's because I was cooking for 12 hours, so I feel like I owe you and I need to make it up. Don't forget, we are all in this together. Together, we can make the world better. And together, my friends, we are Paradox Media because without you, there is no us. If you have the means, ability, or initiative, if you believe in what I am doing here, or just enjoy hanging out with me on the airwaves, fling some money my way. And it would really help me keep this mothership afloat. I've been door dashing and working my booty off, and my clutch is getting bigger, so I got eggs to go. Baby, you need eggs? I got eggs. If you want to write me, if you need advice or want to share your ghost story, please write me at P.O. Box 663, Fayetteville, Colorado 81122. Night night, love and light. Have a wonderful rest of your evening and sweet dreams.